Chapter 2165. The outer sword domain was as huge as the 9 domains. Even Chu Fengmian couldn't explore the entire outer sword domain in a short time. However, Chu Fengmian had already seen many huge cities built on the plains along the way. These cities were incomparably desolate and had turned into ruins. There seemed to have been a fierce battle on these ruins, which eventually led to the destruction of these cities. However, looking at the ruins in front of him, he couldn't imagine how prosperous the outer sword domain was in the past. This city was large enough to accommodate tens of millions of people. And such a city wasn't limited to just one. Chu Fengmian saw dozens of cities as he flew in the outer sword domain. Such a tyrannical sect couldn't escape destruction in the end. Chu Fengmian looked at the ruined cities and marveled in his heart. Just from the ruins alone, this high sword sect was the largest and most prosperous sect Chu Fengmian had ever seen. Cloud Feather Heavenly Palace and Pure Land Buddhist Temple were far inferior to the upper sword sect. However, what disappointed Chu Fengmian was that there was almost nothing useful left in these ruins. Chu Fengmian wasn't discouraged. His purpose of coming here was to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. The inheritance of the upper sword sect was the most important thing. Chu Fengmian entered the outer sword domain and continued to follow the center of the upper sword execution chart. He flew all the way to the center of the outer sword domain. The spatial laws of the outer sword domain were different from those of the 9 domains. They were more condensed, so it was almost impossible to tear open the space here. Even Chu Fengmian couldn't tear the space apart in the outer sword domain. He could only fly in the form of an escape light. However, even if he used the escape light, he would still be suppressed by the space law. His speed was much slower than when he was in the 9 domains. Fortunately, Chu Fengmian's comprehension of the spatial Dao was far beyond that of ordinary immortal generals. His flying speed wasn't slow. Moreover, he had divine veins that could replenish his strength at any time without needing to rest. Otherwise, under the suppression of the powerful spatial laws, even immortal generals would have to stop to recover their strength after flying for a period of time. Chu Fengmian, on the other hand, didn't need to. He could fly in the direction of the sword execution chart. Finally, half an hour later, an incomparably huge city appeared in front of Chu Fengmian. This city was so big that it was much bigger than any city Chu Fengmian had ever seen. They occupied almost all of the 9 domains. The size of each domain was immeasurable, and the number of cultivators and fey immortals it could house was inestimable. One had to know that Chu Fengmian's current knowledge was far from what he had been in the past. The trip to the Sunhai star system had also broadened his horizons. However, even the largest heaven-worshipping city in the vast sea star system couldn't compare to this huge city before them. This is the entrance to the upper sword sect, the largest city in the outer sword domain, Sword City. There were only 2 words in the name of this city, Sword City. However, these 2 words were the reason why countless experts yearned for this place in ancient times. There was a gate to the upper sword domain in Sword City. Only the disciples of the upper sword sect who cultivated here had the opportunity to enter the upper sword domain. In ancient times, countless cultivators and fey immortals who yearned to join the upper sword sect had settled down in Sword City, hoping that they could join the upper sword sect one day. During the prosperous times of the upper sword sect, there had been hundreds of millions of cultivators and fey immortals living in Sword City. Like the other cities in the outer sword domain, Sword City had been reduced to ruins after a great battle. However, Chu Fengmian could still clearly feel the prosperity of Sword City through the ruins. Chu Fengmian's gaze swept across Sword City. Finally, his gaze fell on the center of Sword City, where there was a huge ancient bronze door. This bronze door was tightly locked. At a glance, there were countless scars on this bronze door. There were tens of millions of scars. This bronze door seemed to have been besieged by countless experts. However, even such an intense siege couldn't shake the bronze door. The bronze door was still tightly shut. Even though the restrictions on the door were already broken, Chu Fengmian could still sense a power that made his heart tremble. Even if Chu Fengmian wanted to forcefully open this bronze door now, he would still die. This is the gate to the upper sword domain. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. Now, all the houses in Sword City had been reduced to ruins. Only this ancient bronze door was still standing. Even after tens of millions of years, it still stood in the center of Sword City. Even after tens of millions of years, the seal on it still could not be completely destroyed. The existence that created this bronze door was definitely powerful beyond Chu Fengmian's imagination. Seems like someone has arrived before me. After observing the bronze door, Chu Fengmian looked at a mountain peak not far from the bronze door. On this mountain peak, a figure stood there. This figure stood on the mountain peak like a sharp sword, piercing the mountain peak. This was a middle-aged man with a cold expression. He carried a spiritual sword on his back that emitted a dazzling sword edge. However, the sword edge on this middle-aged man's body was not inferior to the spiritual sword on his back. This man's aura was extremely powerful. He was in the immortal general realm. However, Chu Fengmian could feel that this man was more powerful than Tianxing Jiendi and Black White Lord. There's always someone better than you. I thought Black and White Lord was already at the peak of the immortal general realm. I didn't expect there to be such an expert. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The appearance of the 9 domains had attracted countless experts. Even the geniuses of the 3 great saint realms had come to the 9 domains. Even Chu Fengmian had never heard of some of these powerful figures. Chu Fengmian had never heard of this cold-looking man. However, with his strength, if he competed with Chu Fengmian for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect, he would definitely become a formidable opponent. While Chu Fengmian was observing this cold-looking man, the cold-looking man also looked at Chu Fengmian. He was also carefully sizing up Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian and this cold-looking man had obviously obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token. That was why they were able to come to Sword City. Sword cultivators who obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token had only one purpose in coming to Sword City, to compete for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. End of chapter. Chapter 2166. Chu Fengmian and the stern-looking man would have to fight over the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance sooner or later. However, the two of them weren't in a hurry to make a move. There were a total of 12 Upper Sword Enforcer tokens. Over the past few days, Chu Fengmian had been observing the situation in the 9 zones. He also knew that all 12 Upper Sword Enforcer tokens had already appeared. Only the person who had the last laugh would be qualified to obtain the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. Now wasn't the time to make a move. Chu Fengmian and the stern-looking man were observing each other's strength. This sword intent. This person should be from the Assassin Tian sect. I don't know if he has obtained the inheritance of the ancient Assassin Tian sect or if the Assassin Tian sect established a new sect in the extraterritorial starry sky. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself as he watched the stern-looking man. Although Chu Fengmian didn't know the identity of the stern-looking man, he could clearly sense the sword intent on his body. This was a sword technique that belonged to the Assassin Tian sect. The Assassin Tian sect was once a famous major sword sect in the history of the 9 zones. It was said that the core sword technique of the Assassin Tian sect, the sky-piercing sword technique, had been passed down from the Upper Sword sect. The stern-looking man's sword technique was indeed inherited from the Assassin Tian sect. However, Chu Fengmian wasn't sure if this person had obtained the inheritance of the Assassin Tian sect from the 9 zones or if he had come from the Assassin Tian sect himself. Although the sky-piercing sword sect had been destroyed in the 9 regions hundreds of thousands of years ago, Chu Fengmian knew that some sects that had disappeared in the 9 regions hadn't been completely destroyed after he had gone to the outer realm. There were also some sects that had left the 9 zones and established new sects in the extraterritorial starry sky. However, regardless of the stern-looking man's identity, he was definitely a formidable opponent for Chu Fengmian. The Skypiercer sword technique was famous for its Tao of assassination, and it was called the Skypiercer. It was an extremely formidable assassination technique, and once it was used suddenly, it was impossible to guard against. Some famous assassins in the history of the 9 zones had cultivated the sky-piercing sword technique. The stern-looking man's strength was even more tyrannical than experts like the Black and White Young Lord. If he suddenly attacked and assassinated Chu Fengmian would be in great danger. Chu Fengmian would have to deal with him carefully. A's half-step celestial realm. It seems that you are the sect master of the Sword Dao sect, Chu Fengmian. While Chu Fengmian was observing the stern-looking man turned his head around and met Chu Fengmian's eyes. Then, he suddenly spoke. As soon as he opened, Fengmian recognized Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian wasn't surprised that someone had recognized him. He had already made a name for himself in the 9 regions. He was no longer an unknown person. This was especially true for Chu Fengmian, who had subdued Patriarch Holy Spring and killed the Black and White Lords. Heavens would have been half-date Tian celestial Tians to the end. Chu Fengmian was the only one in the 9 zones who had such a monstrous talent. Although the stern-looking man had never seen Chu Fengmian before, he recognized Chu Fengmian after taking a look at his aura and realm. That's right. You seem to be from the Sword Dao Tian sect. How should I address you? Chu Fengmian replied, You're right. The man was rather courteous. Sect Master Chu has good eyesight. When he heard Chu Fengmian point out his identity, the stern-looking man was a little shocked. He was different from Chu Fengmian. He had kept a very low profile during his time in the 9 regions and had only made a move when he had snatched the upper sword execution token chart. Among the experts of the 9 zones, there were not many who knew his identity and background. This was the first time he had met Chu Fengmian. The only reason Chu Fengmian could recognize him was because Chu Fengmian recognized the Sword Dao on him. I'm from the Sword Dao Tian sect. My name is Brilliant Void Skypiercer. The stern-looking man, Brilliant Void Skypiercer, looked at Chu Fengmian and said, Brilliant Void Skypiercer? Chu Fengmian repeated the name in his heart. It was an extremely strange name. However, Chu Fengmian didn't care. The extraterritorial starry sky was vast and boundless. Chu Fengmian had seen many people with strange names. Although this name was different from ordinary names, it wasn't enough to make Chu Fengmian make a fuss. It is said that the Sword Dao sect has inherited the sword techniques of the Lord of the Sword Dao. Sect Master Chu has also inherited the sword intent of the Lord of the Sword Dao. Am I right? Brilliant Void Skypiercer raised his head and looked at Chu Fengmian. That's right. Our Sword Dao sect sword techniques are indeed inherited from the Lord of the Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian nodded. He didn't need to hide this matter. Chu Fengmian wanted to rebuild the Sword Dao sect and restore the glory of the Sword Dao sect under the Lord of the Sword Dao 10,000 years ago. Hiding the head and showing the tail wasn't Chu Fengmian's style. Very well. I'm not talented, but I would like to experience the supreme sword techniques of the Lord of the Sword Dao. I wonder if Sect Master Chu is willing to teach me. Brilliant Void Skypiercer fixed his gaze on Chu Fengmian. His eyes were filled with boundless fighting spirit. Chu Fengmian could see that this fighting spirit came from the bottom of his heart. Brilliant Void Skypiercer was an out-and-out Sword Dao madman. In his life, he had challenged countless Sword Dao experts. Now that he saw Chu Fengmian, the first thing he wanted to do was challenge Chu Fengmian. Sword Dao madmen and martial Dao madmen weren't rare in the history of the 9 domains. There would be such madmen in every era. They wholeheartedly pursued martial arts and only wanted to challenge the strongest experts. They honed their strength through battle after battle. Brilliant Void Skypiercer was a Sword Dao madman. He had long heard of the Lord of the Sword Dao. Now that Chu Fengmian had inherited the inheritance of the Lord of the Sword Dao, the first thing he wanted to do was challenge Chu Fengmian. It can't be considered teaching me. If you are willing to fight, I will keep you company. Chu Fengmian didn't hesitate. He immediately agreed the moment Brilliant Void Skypiercer said that. Chu Fengmian had never been afraid of any challenges. Furthermore, Brilliant Void Skypiercer's strength could be considered a formidable opponent of Chu Fengmian's. Fighting him would be a huge benefit for Chu Fengmian. It could increase Chu Fengmian's strength. There were no experts. They had to go into seclusion and cultivate bitterly. Only through battle after battle could they become stronger. Great! Sect Master Chu is indeed a straightforward person. brilliant void Skypiercer's face lit up when he saw Chu Fengmian agree. A wave of shocking sword intent erupted from his body. The spiritual sword on his back was suddenly unsheathed. Dazzling sword intent shrouded the spiritual sword. End of chapter. Chapter 2167. The moment Kungsu Skypiercer's sword intent burst forth, Chu Fengmian was also fully prepared. He unsheathed the ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and held it tightly in his hand. Kungsu Skypiercer was an extremely powerful sword Dao expert. Chu Fengmian had to give it his all and be fully prepared to fight against him. Although the two of them had yet to make a move in the Sword City, they were still accumulating their strength. However, the sword intents bursting out from their backs were already clashing in the air. In a fight between sword cultivators, in addition to strength, it was more about sword Dao and the collision of sword intent. Chu Fengmian and Kungsu Skypiercer did not really make a move. Instead, they chose to use the collision of sword intent to test each other's strength. The two sword intents collided in the air. The sword intent was invisible. However, for sword cultivators like Chu Fengmian and Kungsu Skypiercer, just their sword intent alone was enough to kill. In the center of the collision of sword intents, even some celestial realm experts might end up dying if they rashly charged in. The two sword intents collided in the air. Kungsu Skypiercer cultivated the Skypiercer sword technique. His sword intent was strange and contained extreme sharpness. The Skypiercer sword technique was an assassin's sword technique. As an assassin, he had to kill with a single strike. Therefore, the power of this sword was extremely sharp. Once the brilliant Void Heaven Piercer found an opening, he would be able to kill even an immortal general expert with a single strike with his Heaven Piercer sword art. Compared to the extreme Kun Su's sky-piercing sword intent, Chu Fengmian's sword intent was like an ocean that could contain hundreds of rivers. As the two sword intents collided, Chu Fengmian's sword intent changed countless times. Each collision seemed to be completely different. Massacre sword technique? Sky extinction sword technique? Extreme spiritual sword technique? How many sword techniques has this person cultivated? I can't even tell. His sword intent seems to have hundreds and thousands of sword intents, but it's a little different. It has the power of 100 rivers. I've never seen such a sword intent. Kungsu Skypiercer was stunned when he sensed Chu Fengmian's sword intent. The name of the brilliant Void Skypiercer might not be well known in the 9 regions, but he was a renowned sword cultivator in the entire starry sky outside the starry sky. Although he only cultivated the sky-piercing sword art, he had heard of many famous and powerful sword arts. However, the moment he saw Chu Fengmian's sword intent, Kungsu Heaven Piercer was still a little stunned. Even with his knowledge, he was unable to tell which sword technique Chu Fengmian mainly cultivated. Although any sword cultivator could cultivate many kinds of sword principles, most of the sword principles that they cultivated were used as support. The true foundation was only one sword technique, just like the heaven-piercing sword technique that the brilliant Void Heaven Piercer had cultivated. However, the Kungsu Skypiercer could sense that Chu Fengmian's sword intent contained hundreds to thousands of sword techniques. Furthermore, each of these sword techniques seemed to be a major sword technique. Even with his experience, he still could not understand the origin of Chu Fengmian's swordsmanship. Impressive, impressive. He is worthy of inheriting the inheritance of the Sword Path Master. I have never seen such a sword technique before. The brilliant Void Skypiercer observed a few times but was unable to see what sword technique Chu Fengmian was cultivating. Thus, he gave up and spoke indifferently. It seems like we can only see the truth through a fight. Since the brilliant Void Skypiercer could not see the true origin of Chu Fengmian's sword technique, they could only exchange blows. The brilliant Void Skypiercer is indeed a sword path genius to be able to cultivate the sky-piercing sword technique to such a mysterious level. On the other side, Chu Fengmian had already understood most of the brilliant Void Skypiercer's sword technique the moment he clashed with it. The sky-piercing sword technique is not considered the most powerful sword technique among the thousands of sword techniques. However, the brilliant Void Skypiercer has already comprehended the sky-piercing sword technique to its peak. If the brilliant Void Sky had chosen to assassinate an immortal marquee powerhouse, he would have had a chance of succeeding. However, the brilliant Void Skypiercer had taken the initiative to challenge Chu Fengmian and gave up on his most powerful assassination technique. If the brilliant Void Skypiercer had come directly to assassinate Chu Fengmian would be in great danger if he was not careful. Although he would not die, he would still be injured. However, since the brilliant Void Skypiercer had chosen to fight Chu Fengmian head-on, Chu Fengmian was not afraid at all. Make your move. Chu Fengmian held the ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword and stood on the Sword City, looking coldly at the brilliant Void Skypiercer. Chu Fengmian did not panic in the face of the brilliant Void Skypiercer. He was extremely calm. This calmness surprised Kungsu the Heaven Piercer. Given his reputation, any true immortal generals would be extremely nervous, fearful, or even serious when facing him. They would show all sorts of different expressions. However, Chu Fengmian was the only one who was as calm as him. It was as if the brilliant Void Skypiercer's attack would not affect his state of mind at all. This was an attitude that could only be displayed when one was extremely confident. The brilliant Void Skypiercer did not know where Chu Fengmian's confidence came from. However, the fighting spirit in his eyes surged even more. The stronger Chu Fengmian was, the more interested he would be. The more the brilliant Void Skypiercer wanted to fight Chu Fengmian. Buzz! Suddenly, the sword in the brilliant Void Skypiercer's hand moved. His sword flashed and turned into a sword light that shot towards Chu Fengmian. Boom! However, as the brilliant Void Skypiercer unleashed his sword, the center of the Sword City was suddenly torn open and turned into a spatial passageway. At that moment, another person came from the depths of the void to the Sword City in the outer sword domain. Two figures slowly walked out of the spatial passageway. This time around, the two people who had come had actually come together. The brilliant Void Skypiercer's eyes flickered when he saw the two figures. There was a hint of fear in his eyes. The sword light in his hand suddenly disappeared. Then, the brilliant Void Skypiercer spoke to Chu Fengmian. It seems like today is not a good time to fight. As he spoke, the brilliant Void Skypiercer also put away the spiritual sword in his hand, indicating that he had stopped. Originally, only Chu Fengmian and the brilliant Void Skypiercer were in the Sword City. The brilliant Void Skypiercer wanted to fight Chu Fengmian. End of chapter. Chapter 2168. However, the sudden arrival of someone made the brilliant Void Skypiercer stop. Although the battle between Chu Fengmian and the brilliant Void Skypiercer was not a battle of life and death, they had to face it with all their might. If someone suddenly launched a sneak attack at that time, it would be a disaster for both of them. Therefore, when some experts fought, they would choose some secret places to avoid being detected by others and being ambushed. It was not only the brilliant Void Skypiercer. Chu Fengmian also put away the thought of fighting with the brilliant Void Skypiercer when he saw that someone had arrived. The brilliant Void Skypiercer's sky-piercing sword technique had reached the great success stage. Even Chu Fengmian wanted to have a contest with him to observe the brilliant Void Skypiercer's sky-piercing sword technique. The 9-region sword technique that Chu Fengmian created was meant to accommodate all the sword techniques in the world and give birth to the best sword technique in the world. Chu Fengmian felt that he had gained some insights from the confrontation with the brilliant Void Skypiercer's sword intent. It would be extremely beneficial for Chu Fengmian to have a real battle with the brilliant Void Skypiercer. However, the sudden arrival of someone had dispelled all of this. Chu Fengmian did not dare to take the risk of fighting with the brilliant Void Skypiercer. After all, the martial artists and Fey immortals who came to Sword City were ultimately there for the inheritance of the Sword Sect. Every sword cultivator who possessed the upper sword execution token illustration was hostile to each other. At this moment, no one would miss the opportunity to kill one of them. Chu Fengmian stopped and looked at the sky above Sword City. The spatial passage that had been torn open gradually disappeared. Only two figures were left. One was an old man and the other was a young man. Both of them contained sharp sword intent, but their swordsmanship was different. It seemed that they were not from the same sword sect. However, the two of them had come together. Obviously, they had joined forces. Are they experts from the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance? Chu Fengmian suddenly felt a sense of familiarity when he saw the old man and the young man. He observed carefully and found that the two of them were experts from the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance. Chu Fengmian had killed Tianqing Jiandi. Not only had he devoured Tianqing Jiandi's blood essence, but he had also obtained Tianqing Jiandi's memories, allowing him to recognize the old man and the young man. The old man's name was Flying Sword Emperor. He was one of the true giants in the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance. His status was even higher than Tianqing Jiandi, Martial Ghost Old Ancestor, and the others. His strength was unfathomable. Although they were also at the Immortal General Realm, it was easy for them to defeat demon immortals who were also at the Immortal General Realm. It was said that the Flying Sword Emperor had been cultivating for 100,000 years in the Immortal General Realm. His strength had reached an unimaginable level. He was considered undefeatable among the immortal generals. The young man was Blood Shadow Swordmaster. It was said that he came from Lian Heaven, one of the three great sacred realms. It was unknown why he had joined the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance. In terms of strength, the Blood Shadow Swordmaster's strength should be below the Flying Sword Emperor. However, in Tianqing Jiandi's memories, he was extremely afraid of the Blood Shadow Swordmaster. This person's swordsmanship was extremely strange. Coming from the three great sacred realms, Tianqing Jiandi did not dare to act rashly against him. This time, the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance had obtained 2 upper sword execution portraits. The strength of the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance is more powerful than I imagined. Chu Fengmian looked at the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Swordmaster with a fearful expression. Others might not know, but Chu Fengmian knew. If Chu Fengmian had not killed the Heavenly Sacred Sword Emperor, it would have been equivalent to obtaining 3 upper sword execution portraits in the 100 Ultimate Star Regions Alliance. There were a total of 12 upper sword execution portraits, and the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance had obtained 3 of them. This showed the strength of the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance among the 9 domains, where experts were as common as clouds. Tianqing Jiandi's strength was not even considered the strongest in the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance. There were some secrets that Chu Fengmian did not know, but he understood how terrifying the hidden strength of the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance was. While Chu Fengmian was observing, the Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Swordmaster also looked at Chu Fengmian and Brilliant Void Skypiercer. Finally, the Blood Shadow Swordmaster's gaze fell on Chu Fengmian, and a trace of surprise flashed in his eyes. Although Brilliant Void Skypiercer's reputation was not well known in the 9 domains, he was still a well-known expert in the entire extraterritorial star domain. They were not surprised that Brilliant Void Skypiercer had obtained an upper sword execution portrait. However, it was indeed strange that Chu Fengmian, a half-step celestial being, was standing there. It should be known that even immortal generals might not be able to keep the upper sword execution portrait in their hands. In the past few days, several immortal generals had fallen because of this upper sword execution portrait. Now that Chu Fengmian could strut around Sword City, it was clear that he had also obtained an upper sword execution order diagram. This must be Sect Master Chu of the Sword Dao Sect. The Blood Shadow Swordmaster's lips moved. Just as he was about to speak, the Flying Sword Emperor beside him spoke first. He looked at Chu Fengmian and said directly, "The Sword Dao Sect?" When the Blood Shadow Swordmaster heard this name, he suddenly remembered that the upper sword execution portrait that had first appeared had come from the Sword Dao Sect. In order to fight for the upper sword execution portrait in Chu Fengmian's hands, an immortal general expert, Ancestor Holy Spring, had been subdued and turned into hard work. It had even caused the black and white young lords to fall. Although the Blood Shadow Swordmaster had not seen this with his own eyes, he had heard that Chu Fengmian, the sect master of the Sword Dao sect, had obtained the sword intent of the master of the Sword Dao. With the sword intent of the master of the Sword Dao, he could contend against immortal generals. "You are that lucky lad?" The Blood Shadow Swordmaster looked at Chu Fengmian with disdain in his eyes. In his opinion, Chu Fengmian was at most a lucky lad. Even if he had obtained the sword intent of the master of the sword Dao, it did not mean that Chu Fengmian was powerful. After all, the power of a wisp of sword intent was lost every time it was consumed. It would eventually dissipate completely. At that time, Chu Fengmian, who was a half-step celestial being, would be no different from an ant in his eyes. After knowing Chu Fengmian's identity, the Blood Shadow Sword Master did not put Chu Fengmian in his eyes at all. "Let me give you a piece of advice. Leave obediently now lest you lose your life. The inheritance of the Upper Sword Dao sect is not something that a lad like you is qualified to fight for." The Blood Shadow Sword Master's tone was extremely disdainful. Although he said that he was advising Chu Fengmian, it sounded like he was dismissing an ant. "Is that so? It is not up to you whether I am qualified to fight for it or not. However, let me give you a piece of advice. If you still dare to fight for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Dao sect, you will only end up dead," Chu Fengmian said coldly. End of chapter. Chapter 2169. Since the Blood Shadow Sword Master had provoked him directly, Chu Fengmian would naturally not be polite. A mere half-step celestial being ant dares to speak so arrogantly? Do you really think that you're invincible just because you had some fortuitous encounters? Die! The Blood Shadow Sword Master was enraged when he heard Chu Fengmian's words. Suddenly, a blood-red sword light slashed towards Chu Fengmian. This sword light contained boundless killing intent. The Blood Shadow Sword technique was one of the sword techniques that focused on killing. It was extremely powerful. Even an immortal general sword cultivator expert might not be able to react in time to the sudden slash of the sword. He used his killing move without saying a word. The Blood Shadow Sword Master wanted to kill Chu Fengmian the moment he attacked. "Just this little Blood Shadow Sword technique? You dare to use it in front of me? Kill!" Chu Fengmian sneered when he saw the blood-red sword light slashing towards him. Suddenly, a sword was unsheathed in his hand. Then, a surge of killing intent was emitted and slashed towards the Blood Shadow Sword Master. The power of this sword was much more powerful than the Blood Shadow Sword Master's sword light. Suddenly, the two sword lights collided in the air. The Blood Shadow Sword Master's sword light was instantly broken by the collision. A surge of sword essence slashed towards the Blood Shadow Sword Master. Chu Fengmian actually gained the upper hand in this move. The Blood Shadow Sword Master did not seem to have expected this. When he saw Chu Fengmian's sword light slashing towards him, he immediately condensed his immortal power and formed a barrier in front of him. However, before this barrier could fully condense, Chu Fengmian's sword light had already slashed towards it. Instantly, the barrier was shattered. The overbearing sword light slashed towards the Blood Shadow Overlord. PFFF. The sword light slashed into the Blood Shadow Sword Master's chest. Immediately, the Blood Shadow Sword Master's body was sent flying and he spat out blood. The Flying Sword Emperor and Kungsu Skypiercer were shocked when they saw this scene. They blinked their eyes as if they were trying to confirm the scene in front of them. They could not believe that the Blood Shadow Sword Master had lost so miserably in this exchange. The Blood Shadow Sword Master had taken the initiative to attack. However, he was struck by Chu Fengmian's counterattack and injured him. If the Blood Shadow Sword Master did not react at the last moment and used his immortal power to form a barrier to block Chu Fengmian's attack, the Blood Shadow Sword Master was the Blood Shadow Sword Master on the spot. The Shadow Sword Master was the Sword Master. The Shadow Sword Master was Sword Master to was the Blood Sword Master was Sword Master. Was the Blood Shadow Sword Master was unfathomable and unfathomable? Sword Master to the Sword Master to Sword Master was to be defeated to him to take to the end Master to be defeated to him. To Fang Sword Master S Sword Master to attack. Was to him Fen Fengmian. Fain to him was to the end Sword Masters. Fen. Was to twos. Was to be, to the blood was to be. Kill him while he was down. Chu Fengmian would never show mercy to his enemies. Whoosh! The sword light in Chu Fengmian's hand moved. Murderous intent surged and merged into the sword edge. Suddenly, it turned into a blood-red sword light and slashed towards the Blood Shadow Sword Master. The power of this blood-red sword light was even more powerful than the previous one. It was tens of thousands of feet long and it slashed towards the Blood Shadow Sword Master from all directions. The Blood Shadow Sword Master had just been sent flying. Before he could even take a breather, Chu Fengmian attacked him again. His face was filled with fear as he hurriedly mobilized his immortal force to prepare his strength. However, Chu Fengmian's sword light was faster than he had imagined. Before the Blood Shadow Sword Master could complete his immortal force, Chu Fengmian's sword light had already slashed towards him. At this critical moment, a sword light slashed from the side. This sword light collided with the sword light formed by Chu Fengmian's massacre swordsmanship. Immediately, the two forces were neutralized. The person who attacked was the Flying Sword Monarch. Seeing that the Blood Shadow Sword Master was in danger, the Flying Sword Monarch could not help but attack as well. The Blood Shadow Sword Master was an expert of the 100 Extreme Star Domain Alliance. The Flying Sword Monarch would not sit idly by and watch the Blood Shadow Sword Master be killed by Chu Fengmian. "Why? Both of you want to come at me together?" Chu Fengmian said coldly when he saw the Flying Sword Monarch attacking. Although the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master were strong when they joined forces, Chu Fengmian was not afraid of them. This is not the time to fight to the death. Sect Master Chu, you don't want others to take advantage of you, right? The Flying Sword Monarch said to Chu Fengmian. He did not attack. His eyes suddenly scanned the surroundings. In Sword City, other than Chu Fengmian, the Flying Sword Monarch, the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the Kuan Su Skypiercer, many other sword cultivator experts had arrived. In the entire Sword City, there were already 8 sword cultivator experts. During this battle, there were more sword cultivator experts who had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token chart that came to Sword City. Every Upper Sword Execution Token chart had a map that led the sword cultivator experts who had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token chart to Sword City and wait for the opening of the Upper Sword Sect's ruins. There was less than half a day left before the opening of the Upper Sword Sect. Those sword cultivator experts who had obtained the Upper Sword Execution Token chart had already rushed over. These people did not have the intention to attack when they saw the conflict between Chu Fengmian, the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. However, they were watching from the side and waiting for an opportunity. If one of them was really forced into a desperate situation, or if both sides suffered great losses, they would not mind eliminating an enemy in advance. The Flying Sword Monarch also saw this point. Therefore, he did not have the intention to continue fighting with Chu Fengmian. If Chu Fengmian was weak and the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master could easily kill him, the two of them would have other thoughts at this time. However, the strength that Chu Fengmian had displayed during the clash between the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the Flying Sword Monarch had already made it clear that Chu Fengmian's strength was not inferior to theirs. Even if the two of them joined forces to deal with Chu Fengmian, they would have to pay a great price. In the end, both sides would suffer great losses. The Blood Shadow Sword Master, the Flying Sword Monarch, the Kuan Su Skypiercer and even Chu Fengmian had come to Sword City for the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. If they were to engage in a bloody battle at this time, it would only allow the others to reap the benefits. End of chapter. Chapter 2170. This time, the Flying Sword Sovereign allowed the Blood Shadow Sword Master to take action because he wanted to test Chu Fengmian's strength. After all, although there were many rumors about Chu Fengmian's strength, Chu Fengmian was only at the half-step celestial being realm. They were also doubtful about some of the rumors about Chu Fengmian's strength. This time, the Blood Shadow Sword Master had already tested Chu Fengmian's strength by exchanging blows with him. Chu Fengmian's strength was comparable to the rumors. Naturally, there was no reason for the Blood Shadow Sword Master to fight to the death. Let's wait until we reach the Sword Sect relic before deciding the victor. The Flying Sword Sovereign said as he turned into a ray of light and left Chu Fengmian's sight. The two of them went to another region of Sword City and separated from Chu Fengmian. When we reach the Sword Sect relic, it will be the time of your death. The Blood Shadow Sword Master glanced at Chu Fengmian coldly before turning into a ray of light and leaving with the Flying Sword Sovereign. This time, he had almost been killed by Chu Fengmian in front of so many people. He had lost all his face. For immortal generals, face was more important than life. Therefore, some immortal generals wouldn't be willing to submit to others even if they were forced into a desperate situation. Chu Fengmian had humiliated the Blood Shadow Sword Master greatly. If he did not kill Chu Fengmian, he would not be able to lift his head in the 9 regions in the future. "I'll be waiting," Chu Fengmian said indifferently. He had no intention to stop them. Chu Fengmian had no intention of fighting a bloody battle with the Flying Sword Monarch and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. His objective was to obtain the inheritance of the Sword Sect. If he were to reveal too much of his strength now, it wouldn't do him any good. This time, there were more and more experts in Sword City. These sword cultivator experts were waiting for an opportunity to deal with others. Chu Fengmian also did not want to be taken advantage of. He also occupied a region of Sword City and stood in the air. This conflict ended just like that. In a short while, another spatial tunnel appeared and more sword cultivator experts came to Sword City. In less than 4 hours, a total of 12 sword cultivator experts had gathered in Sword City. These 12 sword cultivator experts were the ones who had obtained the sword execution token portrait. Sword cultivators who were not on the sword execution chart were not qualified to enter the outer sword domain, let alone Sword City. As they approached the outer sword region, the power of space was screening these sword cultivators to see if they were qualified to enter the outer sword region. Only sword cultivators who obtained the sword execution token illustration could enter Sword City. Just as Chu Fengmian had guessed, there were indeed a total of 12 sword cultivators who had come this time. It seemed that the opening of the Upper Sword Sect's ruins and the distribution of the Upper Sword Execution token were indeed the same as the ancient rules. There would be a total of 12 sword cultivators who would come to compete for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. Chua Jianfan, Sword Emperor Lu, Divinewood Sword Emperor, Chu Fengmian's eyes were also observing the sword cultivator powerhouses that had arrived. Now that he had obtained the memories of the Black and White Masters of Tianqing Jiandi, he had some understanding of the powerhouses that had entered the 9 zones. Chu Fengmian could already recognize the identities of some of them with a single glance. They were all famous sword cultivators in the Outer Realm Starry Skies. For example, the Divinewood Sword Emperor was an immortal general expert who had been famous for a long time. This person had been in the immortal general realm for hundreds of thousands of years. His immortal power was unbelievably strong. It was said that the Divinewood Sword Emperor had the ability to enter the profound heaven realm long ago. However, in order to cultivate his swordsmanship, he had not broken through. Although this person was only in the immortal general realm, his true strength was no different from an immortal marquis of the profound heaven realm. The moment Chu Fengmian felt the aura of the Divinewood Sword Emperor, he felt an incomparable fear. The strength of the Divinewood Sword Emperor was far below that of the Black and White Masters. Even if the Black and White Masters joined forces, they might not be a match for the Divinewood Sword Emperor. There was actually such a powerhouse among the sword cultivators competing for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. Not only Chu Fengmian, but some of the other sword cultivator powerhouses in Sword City also had incomparable fear in their eyes when they saw the Divinewood Sword Emperor. Clearly, the strength of the Divinewood Sword Emperor was something that others were incomparably fearful of. However, the Divinewood Sword Emperor was leisurely standing in the sky above the center of Sword City, looking at the huge bronze gate in the center of Sword City. Other than the Divinewood Sword Emperor, the other sword cultivator powerhouses were almost all famous powerhouses. The weakest of them had reached the level of the Tianqing Jiandi and the Black and White Masters. They were all figures who were countless times more powerful than ordinary immortal general powerhouses. As for the weaker ones, even if they had the opportunity to obtain the Upper Sword Execution Order diagram, they would not be able to keep it. It was only possible that one person would die and the diagram would change owners. It seems that the Tianjin sect paid such a huge price to obtain an Upper Sword Execution Order diagram. Other than the divine wood sword emperor, a young man attracted Chu Fengmian's attention the most. This young man was dressed in a long robe, and his gaze was like a sword. The other people present might not know his swordsmanship, but Chu Fengmian knew it very well. This was the swordsmanship of the Tianjian sect. Previously, the Tianjian sect had sent people from the Sky-Reaching Pavilion to buy the upper sword execution order diagram in Chu Fengmian's hands. They were even willing to spend a sword Dao totem and a sky-high price of 3 immortal artifacts. Clearly, the Tianjian sect was determined to obtain the upper sword execution order diagram. After hitting a wall with Chu Fengmian, the Tianjian sect seemed to have found someone else. It was unknown whether they had bought it or obtained an upper sword execution order diagram, but they had succeeded in the end. Chu Fengmian felt that this young man's appearance was somewhat unfamiliar. Clearly, he was not someone from 10,000 years ago. Chu Fengmian knew all the powerhouses of the Tianjian sect from 10,000 years ago. This young man was clearly a genius who had risen to prominence in the last 10,000 years. However, his strength had already reached the peak of the immortal general realm. He has inherited the most orthodox flying celestial sword technique and made the Tianjian sect pay such a huge price to obtain the upper sword execution order diagram. It seems that this person is a genius that the Tianjian sect has focused on nurturing in this generation. They want to cultivate him into an invincible swordsman. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but think to himself as he looked at the young man. The swordsmanship that this young man cultivated was the flying celestial sword technique. As one of the 7 major sects, the Tianjian sect might have many swordsmanships. Just the disciples of the Tianjian sect alone had cultivated dozens of swordsmanships. However, among all the swordsmanships of the Tianjian sect, the flying celestial sword technique was the most powerful one. It was the most precious swordsmanship of the Tianjian sect. In the Tianjian sect, only the sect masters of each generation were qualified to learn it. End of chapter. Chapter 2171. The young man in front of him wasn't wearing the clothes of the Tianjian sect master, but he cultivated the flying celestial sword technique. The Tianjian sect was willing to break the rules to cultivate this young man. Now, he spent a lot of money to obtain the sword execution token chart. The Tianjian sect had high hopes for this young man. When Chu Fengmian looked at the young man, his eyes were filled with cold killing intent. Chu Fengmian and the Tianjian sect had an irreconcilable feud. Sooner or later, Chu Fengmian would attack the Tianjian sect and destroy the Tianjian sect. If he could kill this young man, it would be equivalent to destroying the genius that the Tianjian sect had painstakingly cultivated. It would make the Tianjian sect's painstaking efforts go down the drain. But now wasn't the time to make a move. Chu Fengmian felt that this young man's strength was definitely not below the Kungsu Skypiercer and the Flying Sword Emperor. Even if Chu Fengmian attacked with all his strength, it would be difficult to kill him. He had to find a suitable opportunity. Chu Fengmian wasn't in a hurry. When he reached the Tianjian sect's ruins, he would naturally find a chance to kill this young man. After observing everyone, Chu Fengmian still stood in the area of Sword City, waiting for the day when the Sword sect's ruins would open. A remnant of the Sword Dao sect. The moment Chu Fengmian saw the young man also noticed Chu Fengmian. His eyes were filled with killing intent as he muttered to himself. This person said that he inherited the inheritance of the Sword Dao Master. But according to the ancestors' guesses, this person is probably related to the Sword Dao sect from 10,000 years ago. Many of the Sword Dao sect's secret treasures suddenly disappeared when the Sword Dao sect was destroyed 10,000 years ago. Perhaps this person obtained them. Once I kill this person, all of them will be mine. The young man sneered. Xian, how about you and I join forces? At this moment, a figure suddenly appeared beside the young man and said. This figure was also a young man. He was in high spirits and his aura wasn't inferior to the Tianjian sect's genius, Xian. Gu Qianjun? Why? Is the Guyu Valley also eyeing the Sword Dao sect? Xian asked when he saw the newcomer. Swordsmanship? Our Guyu Canyon doesn't cultivate sword techniques. What use do we have for the Sword Dao Sect's sword techniques? But I'm interested in the treasures of the Sword Dao Sect. Gu Qianjun sneered. He glanced at Chu Fengmian and said, "Who doesn't want the treasures of the Sword Dao Gate? It's a pity that this brat is now fully fledged and not easy to deal with. How about it, Xian Sungtian? Are you interested in working together? Cooperate? How?" Xian Sungtian's eyes flickered as he pondered for a moment. "It's simple. Let's work together and kill this kid. I don't need the Sword Dao Sect's sword arts, they'll all belong to you. As for the Sword Dao Sect's treasures, I want 60%. How about it?" Gu Qianjun said. 60%? You sure have a big appetite. Xian Sungtian snorted coldly when he heard Gu Qianjun's condition. The greatest treasure in the Sword Principle sect is the swordsmanship of the former master of Sword Principle. As for the rest, they are nothing. Gu Qianjun ignored Xian Sungtian's attitude and continued to speak. This brat is not easy to deal with. You should have heard about what happened in the Sword Origin world. Neither of us can kill him in a one-on-one fight. If we don't work together and let this brat escape, no one will benefit. Moreover, you should know that the Tianjian sect was the first to attack the Sword Dao sect. If this brat grows up, the first to be destroyed will be the Tianjian sect. Gu Qianjun spoke again when he saw that Xian Sungtian was still hesitating. This sentence seemed to have dispelled all of Xian Sungtian's hesitation. Let's do as you say. Let's work together and kill this brat. Xian Sungtian said directly. Well, let's not act rashly now. When we reach the Shang Sword sect's ruins, it will be our chance to act. Didn't the Tianjian sect inherit part of the Shang Sword sect's inheritance? You should know something about the ruins, right? Gu Qianjun asked. That's right. I know some of the dangerous ruins in the Shang Sword sect. When we enter, we will lure this brat there and kill him directly. Gu Qianjun and Xian Sungtian used some means to block their discussions so that the people around them could not hear them. Chu Fengmian, on the other hand, knew very well that the two of them had joined hands, and even the methods they had used to deal with Chu Fengmian had heard everything clearly. When Chu Fengmian arrived at Sword City, he quietly used the power of the Life Seal and his control of the Space Force to envelop the space around Sword City. Although Chu Fengmian couldn't completely seal off the entire Sword City, he could hear every conversation between every sword cultivator clearly. Want to work together to deal with me? Guyu Canyon, Tianjian sect? It seems that my growth has finally attracted the attention of the old fogies of the 7 major sections. However, with my current strength, whoever dares to deal with me is courting death. Chu Fengmian's heart flashed with killing intent. When they arrived at the Shang Sword sect ruins, Chu Fengmian could find a chance to kill Xian Sungtian and Gu Qianjun together. Rumble. At this moment, a shocking sword intent burst out from the center of Sword City. Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered as he looked at the giant bronze door at the center of Sword City. The shocking sword intent was emitted from the bronze door. Ancient runes appeared on the copper door. The power of immortality that had existed for tens of millions of years was unleashed at this moment. For a moment, the sword cultivators near the bronze door retreated, not daring to fight against it. Chu Fengmian could feel that the remaining energy on the bronze door was enough to easily destroy countless immortal generals. The number 1 sword sect, the Shang Sword sect. Chu Fengmian was shocked when he sensed the energy on the bronze door. Even after thousands of years, the broken bronze door could still emit such terrifying energy. Chu Fengmian could not imagine how terrifying the Shang Sword sect was when it was at its peak. Unless he personally went to that era and saw it with his own eyes, he would not be able to see it clearly. As the ancient runes and forbidding auras on the copper door were awakened, the power of the sword intent grew stronger. Half an hour later, the power suddenly reached its limit. When the energy reached its limit, the sealed ancient bronze door slowly opened. End of chapter. Chapter 2172. It's open. The relic of the Upper Sword sect is finally open. Seeing the huge ancient bronze door slowly open, countless sword cultivator experts looked over, their eyes filled with excitement. The first sword sect was the Upper Sword Sect. The Upper Sword Sect represented the most ancient sword Dao inheritance. The unparalleled sword technique of the Upper Sword Sect was one of the top 10 ancient celestial techniques. Whoever obtained the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance would reach the sky in a single bound. Just for the Upper Sword Execution Order chart, there were countless bloody storms in the 9 regions. A large number of celestial generals fell one after another. There was no doubt that all the sword cultivators present were here for the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. Numerous pairs of eyes stared intently at the enormous ancient bronze door. Behind the bronze door was the real relic of the Upper Sword Sect. The Upper Sword Sect's inheritance was hidden inside. Whoever entered first would have the upper hand. Every sword cultivator present held their breaths and gathered their strength, ready to attack at any time and charge in. However, no one dared to approach the huge ancient bronze door. The sword intent that erupted from the huge ancient bronze door caused their hearts to involuntarily tremble. Right now, if anyone were to recklessly approach and be sucked in by this power, they would only be on the path to death. It was said that the Upper Sword Sect had given birth to 3 celestial emperors, countless celestial sovereigns, and countless celestial lords. Even though there was a restriction on the ancient bronze door, it was still not something that the people present could resist after thousands of years. Therefore, before the ancient bronze door opened completely and the power dissipated, no one dared to approach it. Time ticked by. Everyone present tensed up as they stared intently at the huge ancient bronze door. They watched as the bronze door gradually opened. Behind the bronze door was a deep and dark tunnel. Only by passing through the tunnel could one enter the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance. The Upper Sword Sect's inheritance was not in the Outer Sword domain, but in a separate small world. Isn't this the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance? What is this place? Chu Fengmian was standing not too far away from the massive, ancient bronze door. His eyes were fixed on the spatial tunnel that had appeared after the bronze door had opened. Although his expression was calm, his heart was in turmoil. The spatial tunnel behind the ancient copper door was extremely deep. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to see it clearly, but Chu Fengmian possessed the bloodline of progenitor Jianwang. He had also hunted the void beasts in the depths of the void and devoured a lot of mysterious void crystals, so his control of the Tao of space had improved. Chu Fengmian was just testing the waters. He wanted to see where the spatial tunnel led to. Above the spatial tunnel, there were many restriction arrays that were difficult to detect. However, after thousands of years, most of the restriction arrays had been shattered. Chu Fengmian investigated and saw that there was a huge palace behind the spatial tunnel. It was a complete palace and not a ruin. This shocked Chu Fengmian greatly. The destruction of the Upper Sword Sect was recorded in the ancient books. Although there were many different opinions, the fact that the Upper Sword Sect had been destroyed was recorded in every ancient book. When Chu Fengmian came to the Outer Sword domain this time, he saw that the cities in the Outer Sword domain had been reduced to ruins. This also proved that there was no difference from what was recorded in the ancient books. Therefore, the original location of the Upper Sword Sect should have been reduced to ruins like the cities in the Outer Sword domain. However, when Chu Fengmian investigated the spatial tunnel, he could clearly see that there was a complete palace behind it. Moreover, Chu Fengmian couldn't see any traces of a battle. Moreover, there was only this palace behind the spatial tunnel. There was nothing else. It didn't look like the headquarters of a sect at all. Could it be that the spatial tunnel behind the bronze door doesn't lead to the Upper Sword Sect? Could it be somewhere else? Almost everyone guessed that behind this ancient bronze door should be the location of the Shang Sword Sect. However, after Chu Fengmian's investigation, this was beyond Chu Fengmian's expectations. He suddenly felt that the sudden appearance of the Upper Sword execution chart wasn't as simple as it seemed. The High Sword Sect had been destroyed tens of millions of years ago, and the High Sword execution order chart had disappeared from the 9 regions along with the High Sword Sect for tens of millions of years. This time, it suddenly reappeared after tens of millions of years, and with all these strange phenomena, It was definitely not a coincidence. What is the Upper Sword Sect planning? Chu Fengmian was a bit nervous. Who knew how many invincible experts had appeared in the Shang Sword Sect? Even if these experts had existed for tens of millions of years, if this was really a method left behind by an immortal emperor, then, even after thousands of years, it was still extremely dangerous. No matter what kind of trick the experts of the Upper Sword Sect left behind, I don't believe that I can't beat a group of dead people. Chu Fengmian's eyes revealed a bit of determination. Wealth came from danger. At this time, he couldn't shrink back. Chu Fengmian wanted to surpass the master of sword Dao and create the world's #1 sword technique. Chu Fengmian must obtain this unparalleled sword technique of the Upper Sword Sect. Just as Chu Fengmian was thinking, the gradually opening ancient bronze door in the center of Sword City was completely opened. The ancient runes and restrictions on the ancient bronze door shattered as soon as the door was opened. It was as if their power had been completely exhausted. The shocking sword intent that erupted from the ancient bronze door gradually dissipated. The ancient bronze door was no longer enveloped by any power, and it was completely open. Let's go! Whoosh! Whoosh! One figure after another flew toward the ancient copper door at a rapid pace. The moment the shocking sword intent disappeared, the sword cultivators in Sword City pushed their escape light to the extreme and flew towards the ancient bronze door. Everyone wanted to seize the opportunity and be the first to enter the ancient bronze door. Chu Fengmian also urged his escape light to fly towards the ancient bronze door in an instant. End of chapter. Chapter 2173. All the sword cultivator powerhouses had been waiting in Sword City. When the sword intent shrouding the ancient bronze gate disappeared, all of them flew in the direction of the ancient bronze gate at the same time. To the experts present, the distance of a few dozen miles was covered in an instant. Among them, the fastest two were the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. The two of them were already prepared. When all the sword cultivators at the scene activated their conveyance lights and flew towards the direction of the ancient bronze door, they suddenly took action. Spiritual swords suddenly flew out from their palms and turned into a sword array, blocking all the sword cultivator experts. The Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master had already rushed over. The sword array that was left behind was to block the other sword cultivator experts. You want to take all the benefits for yourself? No way! The moment the other sword cultivator experts saw the sword formation, they did not need to say anything. All of a sudden, they attacked together. Streaks of shocking sword essence burst out. The sword cultivator experts who came this time were all here for the sword sect's inheritance. How could they be willing to let the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master take all the benefits for themselves? Streaks of sword essence burst out and sword radiance flashed. The remaining 10 sword cultivator experts, including Chu Fengmian, took action together. Countless sword radiance swept down and bombarded the sword array. Crack! Under the joint attack of the 10 sword cultivator experts, the sword array was almost powerless and was shattered into pieces. Even so, it was still able to buy some time. It was enough for the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master to take the lead and enter the ancient copper door. However, when the two of them approached the ancient copper door, the two of them suddenly slowed down. Their faces were solemn. Their celestial powers burst out from their bodies as if they were resisting some kind of power. What's going on? The other sword cultivator experts present were also keenly aware of this, and a hint of seriousness flashed across their eyes. In such an ancient ruin, it was highly likely that there would be some danger. Even though they had taken the initiative to enter the sword sect ruins this time, there might still be some conspiracy behind it. Hence, when they saw the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master suddenly stop, everyone became more cautious. Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Kun Su Tian Ci and the others approached the ancient bronze door quietly. However, the moment they approached the ancient bronze door, their faces revealed the same expression as Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Sword Honorable. The two of them were also unleashing their full power to resist the suppression of that power. There was a power above the ancient bronze door that was suppressing all the martialists and fey immortals that approached it. Only by resisting this suppression could one enter the ancient bronze door. This is the test to enter the sword sect? Chu Fengmian's heart skipped a beat. He also knew that there were many tests in the upper sword sect. Obtaining the upper sword executor's token only qualified one to compete for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. In order to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect, one had to go through many tests. It seemed that the suppression power above the ancient bronze door was the first test. If one could not even get close to the ancient bronze door and withstand the suppression of that power, one would not be qualified to compete for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. This was the first test to enter the upper sword sect. When Chu Fengmian got close, he also felt a huge force suppressing his body. This huge force was suppressing Chu Fengmian's body and he could not get rid of it. He could only resist it with his strength. This was the only way. This test tested everyone's strength. No matter how strong one's swordsmanship was, no matter how strong one's comprehension of the sword principle was, it would be meaningless if one did not have strength. Just like Chu Fengmian in his previous life, even though his sword principle was unparalleled, he was still a weakling and meaningless. Although the upper sword sect was a sword principle sect, there were also requirements for the strength of the inheritor. Chu Fengmian felt that this huge pressure was so great that even an ordinary immortal general expert would have to use all his strength to resist it. If one wanted to move forward under this huge pressure, one would have to be at least at the level of Tianqing Jiandi. Under this huge pressure, every step forward was extremely laborious, not to mention flying in the air. Flying Sword Emperor, Blood Shadow Sword Master, Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Kun Su Tian Ci and the others had already landed on the ground. As they activated their powers to resist the tremendous force, they ran towards the direction of the ancient copper door. Chu Fengmian had also landed on the ground. However, this huge force was nothing to Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian was only a half-step celestial being, but there was still a gap between him and a true immortal general expert in terms of strength. However, resisting this huge pressure not only required strength, but also physical strength. Chu Fengmian's current physical body had already reached the third level of the immortal real body. Even those who had condensed immortal bones were far inferior to Chu Fengmian in terms of physical strength. Using his deathless true body, Chu Fengmian was able to withstand more than 90% of the pressure. Although he couldn't fly, he could still land on the ground as easily as if it were flat ground. Using his movement technique, he hurried toward the copper gate. The group was less than 10 miles away from the ancient copper gate. Even though Chu Fengmian was unable to fly, he could still reach the gate in an instant if he used his movement technique. However, he was using his movement technique now. Chu Fengmian's figure turned into a phantom. In a few breaths, his figure surpassed many figures and rushed towards the ancient bronze door. In an instant, Chu Fengmian's figure surpassed Kungsu Skypiercer, Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the others. He was only one step away from the Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Sword Master who were at the front. Moreover, Chu Fengmian's movement technique was so fast that he would catch up with them in the next second. What a fast movement technique! What's wrong with this kid? Is he not under the pressure? Or does he have some kind of immortal weapon that can resist this huge pressure? Seeing Chu Fengmian's figure moving so fast, everyone's eyes were filled with shock. Many of them even showed doubts in their eyes. Although Chu Fengmian's strength was on par with theirs, it was rumored that Chu Fengmian relied on the sword intent of the Master of Sword Dao. Although the sword intent was powerful in battle, it was meaningless in the face of this pressure. In their opinion, even if Chu Fengmian could withstand this pressure, it was already extremely difficult. However, they did not expect Chu Fengmian to surpass all of them as soon as he exerted his strength. End of chapter. Chapter 2174. Chu Fengmian's figure flickered continuously. His speed was so fast that it was as if he had completely ignored the great pressure from the ancient bronze door. While the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master were still struggling to resist the great pressure from the ancient bronze door, Chu Fengmian's figure had already closed in on them. The two of them had barely managed to gain the upper hand by using their means. But now, Chu Fengmian had caught up with them. "Stop him!" The Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master looked at each other and roared. Two sword lights slashed towards Chu Fengmian. The one who strikes first gains the upper hand. This was only the first test of the upper sword sect's inheritance. Originally, no sword cultivator would be willing to make a move at this moment and be the first to shed all pretense of cordiality. However, seeing that Chu Fengmian was actually going to snatch the opportunity before them, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master could not help but make a move. The two of them had calculated for a long time and spent a sword formation to gain the upper hand. Now, they were not willing to let Chu Fengmian snatch the opportunity before them. The two sword lights contained boundless killing intent as they slashed towards Chu Fengmian. Since the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master had decided to make a move, they would kill the assassin directly. Among the sword cultivators present, Chu Fengmian was not the strongest one, but he was definitely the most bizarre one. It was already a little shocking that a warrior who was half a step away from the celestial realm could be on an equal footing with so many immortal generals. Especially now that Chu Fengmian had displayed such weirdness, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master could no longer suppress their killing intent. They immediately made a move to kill Chu Fengmian. "Wanna kill me? Do you think I am not prepared?" At the moment when the two sword lights slashed towards him, Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with coldness. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword was unsheathed from his hand. Chu Fengmian had already guessed that no one would be willing to let Chu Fengmian take the lead. They would definitely make a move. Chu Fengmian had been accumulating energy in his hand. The ancestral Dragon Supreme Sword was unsheathed and all the energy it had accumulated earlier was poured into the blade. Sword lights scattered in all directions and a dragon roared. Chu Fengmian wielded the longsword and swung it down. A dazzling sword light slashed out. It was 1,000 feet long and the sharp sword edge could kill everything. The two sword chi that the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master released were mercilessly crushed by the Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. Not good. The faces of Flying Sword Monarch and Blood Shadow Sword Master changed drastically. They did not expect Chu Fengmian to be so ferocious. Originally, they thought that even if they couldn't kill Chu Fengmian, they could at least suppress Chu Fengmian and prevent Chu Fengmian from catching up with them. Their S was it, and it was out of their eyes. After the sword light shattered the two sword chis, it directly slashed towards the two of them. "Winged Immortal!" The Flying Sword Emperor roared. The sword edge in his hand suddenly moved and turned into a barrier. It shrouded the Blood Shadow Sword Master and himself, blocking the power of the sword light. Chu Fengmian's sword light slashed at the barrier, and its power was completely neutralized. However, the Flying Sword Monarch had to use all of his strength to block this sword light. He had no choice but to stop and block the sword light first. It was enough for Chu Fengmian to stop the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. Chu Fengmian did not have the intention to kill the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master. The Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master were peak existences among the immortal generals. Even if it was a one-on-one battle, Chu Fengmian would have to use all his trump cards and spend a lot of time to kill one of them. Moreover, it was a one-on-two battle. To Chu Fengmian, the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect was the most important thing. Although the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master were already dead in Chu Fengmian's heart, Chu Fengmian was prepared to wait until he obtained the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect before finding an opportunity to kill them. "I'll let you live for a few more days. I'll kill you after I obtain the inheritance of the Shang Sword sect." Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with killing intent and he sneered. Since they had shed all pretense of cordiality, Chu Fengmian naturally did not need to be courteous. As soon as he finished speaking, his figure moved and he immediately rushed towards the direction of the ancient bronze door. Even under such tremendous pressure, everyone's speed was extremely fast. Just as Chu Fengmian was exchanging blows with the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the Brilliant Void Sky Piercer caught up from behind. especially the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's speed. It was so fast that it was frightening. It was even faster than Chu Fengmian's previous speed. Chu Fengmian looked over. He could tell that the Divine Wood Sword Emperor should have used a secret technique to resist the great pressure. Chu Fengmian could use his physical body to resist the enormous pressure. Everyone present had their own trump cards, so naturally, they all had their own means to deal with it. Although the fight between Chu Fengmian, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master only lasted for an instant, it allowed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor to catch up. Chu Fengmian performed the Phantom Body technique and pushed his speed to the extreme. He increased his speed and suddenly rushed towards the ancient bronze door. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor had already caught up beside him and was on par with Chu Fengmian. His speed was even faster than Chu Fengmian's. Immortal. At the moment when the Divine Wood Sword Emperor was about to surpass Chu Fengmian's eyes were filled with determination. The 129,600 immortal crystals in his body were activated all of a sudden, and ancient words appeared one after another. Every immortal crystal turned into a formation eye and formed a huge formation from Chu Fengmian's body. The moment this huge formation was formed, the power in Chu Fengmian's body rose steadily. At this moment, it increased by more than 50%. This was the benefit that Chu Fengmian obtained after advancing his immortal real body to the 3rd level. The Immortal Secret Technique. The formation formed by the 129,600 immortal crystals in his body caused Chu Fengmian's power to increase dramatically. Even when Chu Fengmian faced the Black and White Young Lord, Tianqing Jiandi and the others, he did not use this move. It was one of Chu Fengmian's trump cards. Chu Fengmian originally wanted to save this move for later use. However, in order to prevent the Divine Wood Sword Emperor from catching up, Chu Fengmian had no choice but to use it. Chu Fengmian's power increased by 50%. His escape light speed increased by more than double. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor who was about to surpass Chu Fengmian was suddenly pulled apart. End of chapter. Chapter 2175. Within a few breaths, Chu Fengmian had far surpassed the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and was the first to step through the ancient bronze door. The moment he stepped through the ancient copper door, Chu Fengmian felt the world spin. The surrounding space changed intensely, but Chu Fengmian did not panic. He had already scouted the scene behind the ancient copper door, so he was already prepared. Chu Fengmian allowed the power of space to carry his body back and forth. After a few breaths, the scene in front of Chu Fengmian gradually became clear. Chu Fengmian looked around. He had now arrived in front of an incomparably huge palace. The palace in front of him was 1,000 meters tall and incomparably majestic. Trees grew near the palace, and they were also incomparably tall, covering the sky and the sun. Seeing this breathtaking scene, an incomparably ancient feeling welled up in Chu Fengmian's heart. This is actually a small world similar to the ancient Baron's continent. The power here was not spiritual power nor immortal power, but a kind of chaotic qi. This kind of primal chaos qi could only be found in some ancient ruins or continents, just like the primal chaos ruins in the sinkhole sky. However, the small world in front of him was filled with chaotic qi. Moreover, the primal chaos qi wasn't like the one in the primal chaos ruins, which was mixed with extremely toxic miasma. The primal chaos qi in this pocket world was incomparably pure and could be directly devoured for cultivation. It was said that in the most ancient era, before the ancient Baron's continent was shattered, the ancient Baron's continent did not contain spiritual power, but chaotic qi. In the ancient Baron's era, countless famous warriors were born, and it was also related to the chaotic qi. Chu Fengmian felt that if he cultivated in this small world, it would be hundreds of times faster than cultivating in the 9 regions. The elixir refined from chaotic qi, the chaotic pill, was the hard currency of the most ancient era. It was more precious than the immortal stones of today and was priceless. The elixir refined from chaotic qi was even useful to immortal emperors. However, it was extremely difficult to find primal chaos qi in this era. Only in the depths of some ancient spirit springs would there be a little bit of thin primal chaos qi. It was extremely difficult to collect the chaos chi, let alone refining it into a pill. Just like the chaos chi that Chu Fengmian had discovered in the spiritual spring of the heaven-reaching tower in the martial emperor city, it was extremely thin. Even if one were to gather it crazily, it would still be difficult to form a chaos pill. The chaotic chi in the ruins of primal chaos was also thin, and it was mixed with highly toxic miasma. Chu Fengmian could only barely swallow it when he used the heaven-devouring secret technique, and could not refine it into a chaotic pill. However, the chaotic aura contained in this small world was extremely pure. The various scenes were almost similar to the ancient Baron's continent recorded in the ancient books. This is probably a part of the ancient Baron's continent. When the ancient Baron's continent was shattered, it didn't shatter due to a coincidence. Instead, it turned into an independent small world. Chu Fengmian took a glance inside. This small world that contained chaotic chi was much more powerful than the sacred land sword origin boundary that Chu Fengmian had created. The cultivation speed of ordinary martialists and face celestials in the origin sword world was 10 times faster than in the 9 domains. However, if they cultivated in this small world by absorbing the chaotic energy, their cultivation speed would be 10 times faster than in the origin sword world. It was no wonder that there were so many experts in the upper sword sect in that era. Just the chaotic chi in this small world could create countless experts. Heaven-devouring secret technique. Devour. The chaotic pill that was condensed from chaotic chi was more useful to Chu Fengmian than immortal stones. It was priceless. After a brief moment of shock, Chu Fengmian hurriedly activated the heaven-devouring secret technique. His body had turned into a huge vortex. Countless streams of primal chaos chi poured into Chu Fengmian's body. As Chu Fengmian's power condensed, the primal chaos chi gradually solidified. In the end, they turned into gray-colored pills. Even though these pills were gray-colored, they seemed to contain countless mysteries within them. Once they were consumed by someone, the benefits would be endless. Moreover, the energy contained within them was much purer than the energy within the immortal stones. The energy contained in this chaotic pill is equivalent to thousands of immortal stones. Chu Fengmian held a chaotic pill in his hand and said with a shocked expression. This chaotic pill was equivalent to thousands of immortal stones, and this was only the difference in the energy it contained. The chaotic chi was originally a higher level energy than the immortal chi. It had a qualitative leap. It could enhance the strength of immortal emperors, immortal sovereigns, and even invincible immortal emperors. If this chaotic pill was taken out for auction, it would be worth at least tens of thousands of spiritual stones. This was the price during the Desolation era. In this era, primal chaos chi had almost completely disappeared. Even the primal chaos chi contained in some ancient spiritual springs could only condense 2 or 3 chaos pills at most. This chaotic pill could be said to be a priceless item. If Chu Fengmian was willing to take it out for auction, it could be sold for tens of thousands of immortal stones. A huge fortune. I came to the remains of Shang Sword sect for the inheritance of Shang Sword sect. I didn't expect to come across such a treasure land. As long as I devour more chaotic chi and condense it into a chaotic pill, it can support me to break through the great tribulation of the heavenly being realm. Chu Fengmian's heart was filled with excitement. The energy of the chaotic pill was purer than the immortal chi in the immortal stones. Chu Fengmian wanted to break through the great tribulation of the heavenly being realm, but what he lacked was a large amount of energy. The chaotic chi in this pocket world was almost endless. Chu Fengmian activated the sky-devouring secret technique to the extreme, madly devouring the surrounding chaotic chi. These chaotic chi were condensed into chaotic pills and fell into Chu Fengmian's empty ring. However, each chaos pill required a large amount of primal chaos chi to condense. Even if Chu Fengmian pushed the heaven-devouring secret technique to its limit, he still needed 10 breaths' time to condense a chaos pill. End of chapter. Chapter 2176. It was not an easy task to condense a large amount of chaos pills. However, it was a windfall for Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian did not think that he could monopolize this small world. He activated the power of the heaven-devouring secret skill to the extreme and devoured as much chaos chi as possible to condense chaos pills. Not long after Chu Fengmian came to this small world, cracks appeared in the surrounding space again. A few more figures came to this small world. Following closely behind Chu Fengmian was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. His strength was already at the top among the sword cultivator experts present, and he almost surpassed Chu Fengmian previously. Although Chu Fengmian activated the immortal secret skill and his strength skyrocketed, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor followed closely behind and was the second to come to this small world. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor stepped into this small world and observed the surroundings curiously. Suddenly, his face changed abruptly. This small world contained chaos chi everywhere and it could not be hidden from anyone. After a short moment of shock, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor started to devour the surrounding chaos chi like Chu Fengmian did. However, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not have the heaven-devouring secret skill. He could only activate his immoral power to collect the surrounding chaos chi. Although it was exhausting, his speed was less than 1/10 of Chu Fengmian's. Even so, the chaos chi in this small world was a great opportunity for the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. This kind of chaos chi had endless benefits regardless of whether it was increasing one's strength or practicing sword skills. Not long after the arrival of the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, the Flying Sword Emperor and the Blood Shadow Sword Master also stepped into the small world. When the two of them arrived in the small world, they scanned the surroundings and saw Chu Fengmian at first glance. Coldness could be seen in their eyes. They had chosen to expend a sword formation to seize the initiative, but they were overtaken by Chu Fengmian. Because of Chu Fengmian, the two of them had to stop midway. In the end, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor also surpassed the two of them. This made the two of them hate Chu Fengmian to the core. However, the resentment in their hearts subsided a little when they saw Chu Fengmian standing there. It was obvious that he hadn't obtained any benefits either. After all, they would have suffered a great loss if Chu Fengmian had obtained any benefits. When Blood Shadow Sword Master and Flying Sword Emperor stepped into the small world, they started to look around too. The first thing that attracted the attention of anyone who stepped into this micro-world was the lofty palace. It was a majestic palace that was thousands of feet high. Anyone who saw it would feel a sense of awe and veneration. However, the incomparably tall palace in front of him was sealed off. The ancient doors were shut, and there were countless restrictive formations on top of it. Just the power emanating from it was enough to deter anyone from approaching it. Regardless of whether it was Chu Fengmian who arrived first or the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, none of them chose to approach rashly. Otherwise, if they really encountered some danger, they would want to cry but have no tears. The Blood Shadow Sword Master and the Flying Sword Monarch also noticed this point. They also retreated slightly and sat down on an empty space not far away from Chu Feng. Just as the two of them were about to rest and absorb the surrounding spirit chi to recover their strength, their expressions changed drastically. Chaotic chi. This place is actually filled with chaotic chi. The Blood Shadow Sword Master and the Flying Sword Emperor looked at each other. Their eyes were filled with extreme shock. Anyone would be incomparably shocked to discover that this small world was actually filled with primal chaos chi. The two of them looked in the direction of Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. They realized that Chu Fengmian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor were also sitting on the ground and absorbing the surrounding chaotic chi. They immediately understood and sat on the ground as well, joining the team of absorbing chaotic chi. Time passed by minute. In Chu Fengmian's empty ring, he had already condensed 100 chaotic elixirs. These 100 chaotic elixirs were all placed in the deepest part of the empty ring by Chu Fengmian. During this period of time, the other sword cultivator experts in Sword City who had obtained the sword execution token illustration also came to this micro-world one after another. There were no weaklings among the sword cultivators who could obtain the sword execution token illustration amidst the bloody storm of the 9 regions. Everyone had passed the first test. It was just a matter of time. Although some of them arrived slowly, it did not mean that they were weak. Chu Fengmian could see that many of these sword cultivator experts still had the intention of hiding their strength. Among the 12 sword cultivators present, only one could obtain the inheritance of the sword sect. Many of them wanted to hide their strength first and strike at the crucial moment to kill with one strike. However, Chu Fengmian did not mind. His strength had already been exposed during the battle in the Origin Sword world. There was no point in hiding it. Using the immortal secret technique was outside of Chu Fengmian's plan. However, Chu Fengmian was the first to enter and he had his own benefits. He could absorb the surrounding chaotic qi. The chaotic qi around the palace had become thinner as everyone devoured it. Although the entire micro-world was filled with chaotic qi, no one dared to rashly set foot in the area outside of the palace. Everyone was well aware of the foundation of the Upper Sword sect. Even if it was a random restriction left behind by an expert of the Upper Sword sect, once touched, there would be the danger of death. Everyone who came to this micro-world surrounded the palace and did not dare to go any further. Under such circumstances, Chu Fengmian, who was the first to enter, devoured the most chaotic qi. For example, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, who was the second to enter, only devoured about 1/10 of Chu Fengmian's chaotic qi. The rest of the people devoured even less chaotic qi. They could barely condense a chaotic pill, which was far less than Chu Fengmian's harvest. This was the benefit of taking the initiative. Time ticked by. Soon, an hour had passed. Within this 1 hour, the surrounding primal chaos aura had been completely devoured. It would take at least 1 or 2 days for it to recover. At this time, many sword cultivator experts had recovered their strength. They stood up one after another. Some of the bolder ones wanted to explore this micro-world in the distance. However, not long after those people left, when they were at most 10 miles away from the palace, they all stopped. They discovered that the surroundings of the palace were completely enveloped by an incomparably powerful formation. End of chapter. Chapter 2177. Everyone present was enveloped by the spirit formation in the palace. Although this array formation was extremely ancient, the power it contained prevented anyone from approaching it rashly. Everyone was trapped in this array. Even if they wanted to leave, they couldn't do so. At this moment, everyone present could not help but discuss among themselves. Are we all going to be trapped in this array? Kungsu Skypiercer said with a frown as he observed his surroundings. He looked around the palace and realized that there was only one door in the huge palace. However, the door was completely sealed and could not be opened. As for the array outside, he did not dare to get close to it. The power it contained was enough to kill an immortal general easily. He could not barge in without permission. We have passed the first test. Next should be the second test. However, the palace door is tightly shut. Could it be that something has changed in the Upper Sword sect ruins after such a long time? Xian Suntian said with a frown as he observed his surroundings. Compared to the others, he had a deeper understanding of the Upper Sword sect. It was said that the Tianjian sect's swordsmanship was inherited from the Upper Sword sect. Some of the ancient books in the Tianjian sect had records about the Upper Sword sect. One of the records was about the Upper Sword sect's inheritance test. According to the records, once the Upper Sword sect's inheritance test began, it would be carried out one by one. Only those who passed all the tests would be qualified to obtain the final inheritance. When everyone passed through the bronze door, they thought that they would have to go through the next test. However, they did not expect to be trapped here. Xian Suntian could not understand why. What kind of bullshasterisk test is this? Is it just to trap us here? A sword cultivator expert could not help but ask angrily. Why don't we join forces to break the array around here and fight our way out? No, this place is full of danger. We can't take the risk. While everyone was discussing, a surprised voice was suddenly heard. Look! The voice came from Kungsu Skypiercer. He suddenly pointed at the palace door and said. Ancient words suddenly appeared on the palace door. These words were so ancient that Chu Fengmian had never seen them before. They were probably words from the primordial era. However, Chu Fengmian immediately understood the meaning of these words when he saw them. These words were inscribed with sword intent. Ordinary people would not be able to read them, but the sword cultivators present were all experts with some attainments in swordsmanship. Even if they did not recognize the words, they could understand the meaning. Words will change because of the vicissitudes of time, but the sword intent will never change. Could the Upper Sword sect have planned this thousands of years ago? Chu Fengmian felt a chill down his spine when he saw the words. These words were deliberately inscribed with sword intent so that sword cultivators in the world would be able to understand the meaning of these words, regardless of whether it was 10 million years later or even 10,000 years later. The inheritance of the Upper Sword sect seemed to have been calculated for thousands of years. It seems that the sudden appearance of the Upper Sword sect's inheritance was not a coincidence. Xian Suntian muttered to himself. He was not the only one. Almost everyone present felt that the appearance of the Upper Sword sect ruins was not a coincidence. Every step had been planned. It was definitely not a coincidence. Let's take a look at the meaning of these words. Everyone's eyes fell on the words. Many of them gathered their sword intent to read the meaning of these words. Is this the second test? There was not much information recorded in the words. It only said that this was the location of the second test. Only those who passed this test could proceed to the next test. It said that this is the location of the second test, but there's nothing here. After understanding the meaning of the words, the Blood Shadow Sword Master frowned and said. The area 10 miles away from the palace was covered by a huge array, making it impossible for people to leave. Obviously, the test was within this 10 miles range. For the immortal generals present, a 5-kilometer radius could be completely explored in an instant. They almost turned this place upside down, but they still couldn't find anything. Could it be that the Upper Sword sect has been here for thousands of years and the so-called test has disappeared? Some of the sword cultivators could not help but ask. That's possible. What should we do? Are we going to be trapped here until we die? Chu Fengmian's mind was extremely calm amidst the discussions. The appearance of the Upper Sword sect inheritance was definitely not a coincidence. Since it was not a coincidence, the test would definitely not disappear. It was just that the place of the test had not been discovered yet. The second test, Chu Fengmian muttered to himself. He suddenly looked in the direction of the huge palace. It was impossible for such a huge palace to appear here by chance. Furthermore, the area where everyone was sealed was coincidentally centered around this huge palace. The test was definitely related to this huge palace. Wealth comes with danger. I can only give it a try. Chu Fengmian had already guessed most of it. The moment he looked in the direction of the huge palace, his body suddenly turned into a ray of light and rushed towards the huge palace. Chu Fengmian's sudden action gave everyone a fright. What's going on? Is this kid crazy? Is he going to force his way into the palace? The restriction on the palace gate is so powerful. Is this kid courting death? Seeing Chu Fengmian's action, some of the sword cultivators could not help but say. Only Xian Suntian and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor looked at Chu Fengmian with shock in their eyes. They seemed to have thought of something. Chu Fengmian stepped in front of the palace. Looking at the sealed door, Chu Fengmian didn't hesitate at all. He took a step forward and rushed towards the sealed door. Rumble! On the palace gate, the power of the restriction exploded. Waves of spiritual energy turned into huge sword light and bombarded Chu Fengmian. Such power could almost shatter the heavens and earth. No immortal generals would be able to withstand such a terrifying power. End of chapter. Chapter 2178. Under such power, almost anyone would have thought of retreating and dodged hastily. However, the moment Chu Fengmian saw the power of the collapse of heaven and earth, his eyes revealed a bit of determination. He didn't retreat at all, and even pushed the speed of the escape light to the extreme, rushing to meet it head-on. Rumble! Boundless sword light rushed over, but Chu Fengmian did not retreat. He did not even activate his power to block it. Instead, he went forward. Sword light pierced through Chu Fengmian's body. However, at that moment, there was not a single drop of blood on Chu Fengmian's body. Instead, the streaks of sword light suddenly disappeared after penetrating Chu Fengmian's body. Illusion? The seal on the palace door is actually an illusion? Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Sungtian rushed towards the palace door the moment Chu Fengmian moved. The other sword cultivator experts also understood at that moment. The terrifying seals on the entrance of the palace were all fake. The entire place was an illusion. It was such an illusion that forced everyone to stay away from it. Now, Chu Fengmian was one step ahead of them. Damn it! Stop that kid! When Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Sword Master saw the illusion, they were extremely angry. They did not expect an illusion to appear in the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance trial. Upper Sword Sect was the #1 sword sect in the world. Hence, in everyone's opinion, the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance trial was also a test of sword skills and comprehension. Never in his wildest dreams would he have expected that the second test would be an illusion. This illusory realm was not even an illusory array. It was simply a sealed door that blocked everyone outside. Flying Sword Emperor and Blood Shadow Swordmaster chased after Chu Fengmian hastily. However, Chu Fengmian's body had already stepped into the palace. It was meaningless for the two of them to chase after him. Chu Fengmian was still the first to pass the second test. On the other side, Chu Fengmian passed through the illusion and stepped into the palace. The illusion was extremely simple. There was no threat inside and one only had to move forward. Even an ordinary person without any power could pass through the illusion and enter the palace. As expected, I guessed correctly. When he arrived at the palace, Chu Fengmian could not help but think to himself. He had already guessed that the Upper Sword Sect's test would definitely not be so difficult that no one would be able to pass. After all, the purpose of the Sword Sect's test was to choose an inheritor, and not to shut out everyone. If the restriction on the door of the palace was real, even 120 immoral generals wouldn't be able to break it, let alone 12 of them. None of this made sense. Therefore, Chu Fengmian guessed that there was something strange about the palace gate. When Chu Fengmian approached it, he guessed that the palace gate was most likely fake. It was an illusion. Now, it seemed that Chu Fengmian had guessed correctly. The space within the palace was extremely huge. It was even bigger than what it looked like from the outside. In the depths of the palace, Chu Fengmian could vaguely make out a number of passageways leading to different places. Chu Fengmian used his spatial Dao to investigate, but he was unable to determine where the passageway led to. The first round tested one's strength. The second round tested one's heart and courage. The third round should be about the main topic. Chu Fengmian muttered to himself as he observed the passageways. Swoosh! Just as Chu Fengmian stepped into the palace to observe the passageways, another two figures arrived at the palace. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor and Xian Sungtian followed closely behind and stepped into the palace. Like Chu Fengmian, the two of them also noticed the abnormality on the palace gate. However, they did not see through the mystery within. When they saw Chu Fengmian move, the two of them understood. Although they hurriedly chased after him, they were still a step too late. As expected of the Sword Sect leader. When the Divine Wood Sword Emperor arrived at the palace, he could not help but look at Chu Fengmian and said. His gaze was fixed on Chu Fengmian, as if he wanted to see through all of Chu Fengmian's details. From the beginning, Chu Fengmian was not eye-catching. Although Chu Fengmian was the only sword cultivator who was half a step into the celestial realm, there were rumors in the 9 regions as to why Chu Fengmian was able to obtain the sword execution token chart. It was because Chu Fengmian had obtained the sword will of the Master of Sword Dao. His strength was comparable to an immoral general. However, even though Chu Fengmian's strength was comparable to an immoral general, everyone present was at the immoral general realm. They were even invincible in the immoral general realm. Not many people cared about Chu Fengmian from the beginning. For example, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor did not take Chu Fengmian seriously at the beginning. Previously, when Chu Fengmian finally surpassed him in the first test and took the first place, no one paid attention to it. After all, he could also see that Chu Fengmian had used a secret technique to surpass him at that time. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor also knew such a secret technique. If he wanted to use it, catching up to Chu Fengmian would be a problem. However, in order to preserve his strength, he did not use it. However, Chu Fengmian actually discovered the mystery of the second stage before him. It could not be described as a coincidence. Once might be a coincidence, but twice in a row was definitely not a coincidence. Only then did he realize that he had underestimated Chu Fengmian from the beginning. Not only the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, Xian Tsungtian, as well as the brilliant Void Heaven Piercer, Flying Sword Emperor, and the others who entered later, all looked at Chu Fengmian with an extremely serious gaze. From the beginning, they had never treated Chu Fengmian as an opponent. However, this time, no one dared to underestimate Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian did not care that he had attracted everyone's attention. For the Upper Sword Sect assessment, Chu Fengmian had to go all out. Chu Fengmian did not have the confidence to pass the assessment if he wanted to preserve his strength. Since he would have to reveal his strength sooner or later, he would have to seize the opportunity earlier. Moreover, since the Upper Sword Sect had set up so many tests, whoever fought for first place would definitely receive benefits. Everyone who had arrived at the palace scanned their surroundings, sizing up the situation within the palace. According to the previous two rules, the third test would be carried out in the palace after arriving at the palace. Chu Fengmian had taken first place in the previous two tests. This time, they would not let Chu Fengmian take the lead again. Even the Flying Sword Emperor, Blood Shadow Sword Master, Xian Tsungtian, and the others stared at Chu Fengmian, observing his every move. End of chapter. Chapter 2179. Just when everyone had arrived at the palace and was carefully observing the interior of the palace, a sound suddenly rang out. Suddenly, a sound could be heard, as if an ancient stone door was slowly opening. Chu Fengmian looked over and saw that one of the sealed passages in the depths of the palace had suddenly opened. As the stone door opened, a figure suddenly walked out from it. There are still living people in the Upper Sword Sect ruins? The moment Chu Fengmian saw this figure, he couldn't help but be stunned. The Upper Sword Sect ruins had not appeared for millions of years. Chu Fengmian's group could be said to be the first group of people to enter the ruins since the Upper Sword Sect was destroyed millions of years ago. But now, a figure suddenly walked out from behind the stone door. Not only Chu Fengmian, but everyone present was stunned the moment they saw this figure. For a moment, they were incomparably nervous as they looked over. Millions of years had passed. Not to mention human warriors, even divine beasts like the ancient war dragon would only end up dying. It was almost impossible for them to live for such a long time. Warriors and demon immortals who had stepped into the celestial realm had a long lifespan. It was not a problem for them to live for more than 100,000 years. However, this was already the limit. Those who could live for more than 1,000,000 years were not only powerful, but also because of their powerful bloodline. It was simply unimaginable for them to live for more than 1,000,000 years. If there were other living people in the palace, wouldn't it mean that this person had lived for more than 1,000,000 years? Everyone looked at the figure nervously. This figure slowly walked out from behind the stone door. He appeared to be a middle-aged man. After his gaze swept across the crowd, he slowly opened his mouth and spoke. "All 12 of you have come to the palace. It seems that the people who came this time are not bad. I didn't expect that after millions of years, there would still be such sword cultivators in the 9 regions." The middle-aged man looked no different from a living person. However, Chu Fengmian carefully examined him and found that he could not see any vitality in the middle-aged man. Every warrior and Fey god had a unique life force in them. And when their life force disappeared, they would become a dead person or some other existence. Chu Fengmian could not sense any vitality in the middle-aged man in front of him. This was enough to prove that this person was not a living person. Chu Fengmian was relieved that the middle-aged man was not a living person. If it was a living person who had lived for more than 1,000,000 years, Chu Fengmian could not imagine how terrifying this person's strength would be. An immortal emperor, or even a ruler who had surpassed an immortal emperor. However, an existence with such strength was not something that Chu Fengmian could touch. However, Chu Fengmian was also very curious about who the middle-aged man in front of him was. Since this person had walked out from the depths of the palace, he must be related to the Upper Sword sect. "Who are you?" Before Chu Fengmian could speak, the Blood Shadow Sword Master couldn't help but ask. "Me? You can call me Jianwang. As for all of you, I'm the examiner for the Upper Sword sect's test this time. I'll decide who will pass the test and obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect." The middle-aged man, Jianwang, looked at the crowd and said slowly, "Sword reversal." Hearing this name, everyone present furrowed their brows. They were searching for this name in their minds, but they had never heard of such a name. Most of the sword cultivators present came from the extraterritorial starry sky and did not know much about the Upper Sword sect. After all, the Upper Sword sect was one of the 9 region sects. Although Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and Gu Qianjun came from the 9 region sects, they did not know much about the Upper Sword sect. The Upper Sword sect had been destroyed thousands of years ago and was completely annihilated in the long river of history. Chu Fengmian's understanding of the Upper Sword sect was limited to a few words in some ancient books. However, many of the contents recorded in these ancient books were heard from other places, so it was uncertain whether they were true or false. Even though the Upper Sword sect did have an invincible expert named Jianwang, the current Chu Fengmian could not recognize him. However, Chu Fengmian believed Jianwang's words. After all, this person came out from the depths of the palace. Moreover, Chu Fengmian could see that this person had controlled the restriction when he came out from the depths of the palace. Just based on this point alone, it was enough to prove that this person was indeed from the Upper Sword sect. This time, the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect has appeared once again. There are a total of 12 Upper Sword Executor tokens. All 12 of you have the opportunity to obtain the inheritance of the Upper Sword sect. However, only one person will be able to obtain the inheritance. As for the others, although they may not necessarily obtain the inheritance, they will also be rewarded if they perform well in the assessment. However, there will be considerable danger in this inheritance. If anyone is afraid of death, you can leave now. Jianwang swept his gaze across the crowd and suddenly waved his hand. An array formation suddenly appeared in front of everyone. No restriction was placed on the array formation, so everyone knew that the array formation led to the 9 regions. You only have one chance to withdraw if you wish to do so. The fate of those who stay will be left to fate. Everyone looked at the array formation, but no one stepped forward to leave. It should be known that everyone had come to the Shanjian sect ruins for the inheritance of the Shanjian sect. Just to obtain the Shanjian sect execution order chart, it had set off a bloody storm. Who knew how many experts had fallen in the 9 regions? None of the people present were afraid of death. After coming here, no one was willing to leave. Very well. Since no one is leaving, then the Upper Sword sect's inheritance assessment can be considered to have officially begun. Jianwang waved his hand and the teleportation array suddenly disappeared. Once the teleportation array dissipated, it would mean that everyone had lost their way out. Unless they passed the tests one by one, they would die in the tests. This was the only way out. As the teleportation array left, Jianwang's palm moved again and a surge of spiritual energy burst out. 2 paths appeared in the depths of the palace and the stone doors that sealed the 2 paths opened. The 2 paths were pitch black and deep, and one couldn't see the end of them. Many of the people present used their common sense and spiritual awareness to investigate, but they found nothing. End of chapter. Chapter 2180. Chu Fengmian also used his spiritual consciousness to check it out. Chu Fengmian had lived 2 lifetimes, so his spiritual consciousness was much stronger than any of the immortal generals present. However, how could he check it out? the only thing that could be seen from within was pitch-black darkness. Other than that, nothing could be seen at all. This round of assessment is very simple. You just need to enter the passageway in order. As long as you can reach the end, you'll have completed the assessment. Jianwang said after seeing that everyone had probed for a while. Sir Jianwang, what's in the passageway? The Flying Sword Emperor looked at Jianwang and asked respectfully. I can't say. You just need to know that once you enter, do your best and reach the end. Jianwang shook his head and said. You're all sword principle experts, so there's no need to be so timid. Sword principle is a path to advance courageously. If you're timid, how can you talk about the sword? Who's willing to be the first to enter? Jianwang glanced at everyone present. Everyone was hesitant as they couldn't find out what was in the passageway. Judging from Jianwang's tone, there would be a lot of danger in the assessment and no one was willing to be the first to enter. If no one is willing, then you go in first. Jianwang glanced at everyone and his gaze suddenly fell on Blood Shadow Swordmaster. He raised his hand and pointed at the passageway on the right. Yes. Blood Shadow Swordmaster saw that Jianwang pointed at him first, so he could only brace himself and walk towards the right passageway. Blood Shadow Swordmaster took a step into the passageway and his figure immediately disappeared into the darkness. After seeing Blood Shadow Swordmaster enter, everyone else came to the side of the passageway and wanted to check out what was going on inside. The passageway seemed to have the effect of shielding energy fluctuations. When Blood Shadow Swordmaster entered, no one could sense any movement from the outside. Time ticked by. Half an hour passed, but there was still no sign of movement from the tunnel. The middle-aged man, Jianwang, stood in the middle of the palace and looked at the direction of the passageway calmly. During this period of time, Kun Su, the Skypiercer, Xian Sungtian and the others tried to talk to Jianwang to ask about the upper sword sex inheritance examination. However, Jianwang's face was ice-cold, causing everyone to hit a wall. Chu Fengmian heaved a sigh of relief. Chu Fengmian couldn't even begin to imagine how powerful a person who had lived for tens of millions of years would be. An immortal emperor, or even a ruler who surpassed immortal emperors. However, Chu Fengmian still couldn't touch such a powerful existence. However, Chu Fengmian was extremely curious about exactly who this middle-aged man before him was. Since this person had walked out from the depths of the palace, then he was definitely related to the sword sect. Who are you? Before Chu Fengmian could speak, the Blood Shadow Swordmaster couldn't help but ask. Me? You can call me Jianwang. As for all of you, I'm the examiner for the upper sword sex test this time. I'll be the one to decide who will pass the test and obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. The middle-aged man, Jianwang, looked at the crowd and said slowly. Jianwang? Hearing this name, everyone present furrowed their brows. They were searching for this name in their minds, but they had never heard of such a name. Most of the sword cultivators present came from the extraterritorial starry sky, so they didn't know much about the upper sword sect. After all, the upper sword sect was one of the 9 region sects. Although Chu Fengmian, Xian Sungtian, and Gu Qianjun came from the 9 region sects, they didn't have a deep understanding of the upper sword sect. The upper sword sect had been destroyed tens of millions of years ago and was completely annihilated in the long river of history. Chu Fengmian's understanding of the upper sword sect was limited to a few words in some ancient books. However, many of the contents recorded in these ancient books were heard from other places, so it wasn't certain if they were true or false. Even though the upper sword sect did once have an invincible expert named Jianwang, Chu Fengmian couldn't recognize him now. However, Chu Fengmian believed Jianwang's words. After all, this person came out from the depths of the palace. Moreover, Chu Fengmian could see that this person had controlled the restriction when he came out from the depths of the palace. Just based on this point alone, it was enough to prove that this person was indeed from the upper sword sect. This time, the inheritance of the upper sword sect has appeared once again. A total of 12 upper sword executor tokens have been issued. All 12 of you have the opportunity to obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect. However, only one person can truly obtain the inheritance. As for the others, although they might not necessarily obtain the inheritance, they will also be rewarded if they perform well in the assessment. However, there will be great danger in this inheritance. If anyone is afraid of death, you can leave now. Jianwang swept his gaze across the crowd and suddenly waved his hand. An array suddenly appeared in front of everyone. There were no restrictions placed on the array, so everyone knew that the array led to the 9 regions. This is the only chance to withdraw. Those who stay will have their lives decided by fate. Everyone looked at the array, but no one stepped forward to leave. After all, everyone had come to the Upper Sword Sect remnant for the inheritance of the Upper Sword Sect. Just to obtain the Upper Sword Executor token, it had set off a bloody storm. Who knew how many experts had fallen in the 9 regions? None of the people present were afraid of death. After coming here, no one was willing to leave. Very well. Since no one is leaving, then the Upper Sword Sect's inheritance assessment can be considered to have officially begun. Jianwang waved his hand and the teleportation array suddenly disappeared. Once the teleportation array dissipated, it would mean that everyone had lost their way out. Unless they passed the tests one by one, they would die in the tests. This was the only way out. As the teleportation array left, Jianwang's palm moved again and a surge of spiritual energy burst out. 2 paths appeared in the depths of the palace and the stone doors that sealed the 2 paths opened. The 2 paths were pitch black and deep, and one couldn't see the end of it. Many of the people present used their common sense and spiritual awareness to investigate, but it was to no avail. End of chapter. Chapter 2181. Its Enlightened Sword Qin. Seeing the shocking sword light erupting from the passageway, many people recognized that this shocking sword light was the swordsmanship of Immortal Sword Qin. The sword cultivators present had been famous for a long time. They were familiar with each other's swordsmanship and sword principle. This sword light was enough for them to recognize the owner of this sword light. What's going on? What's the meaning of this sword light? Many pairs of eyes stared in the direction of the tunnel. They wanted to see if anything flew out from the tunnel this time. When the Blood Shadow Sword Master had perished, the Upper Sword Execution Seal diagram had flown out of the passageway and landed in Jianwang's hands. However, this time, after waiting for a while, they realized that nothing was coming out of the tunnel. However, someone has passed the test. Just as everyone was still guessing, Jianwang suddenly spoke. Jianwang looked in the direction of the passageway with a smile in his eyes. He nodded his head, clearly satisfied with what he had seen. He passed. Enlightened Sword Qin passed the test? What's going on? Blood Shadow Sword Master died in the tunnel and Enlightened Sword Qin passed the test? Many of the sword cultivators present looked at each other, unable to figure out what was going on. In terms of strength, Blood Shadow Sword Master was definitely above Enlightened Sword Qin. In terms of age, Blood Shadow Sword Master was much younger than Enlightened Sword Qin. In terms of aptitude, Blood Shadow Sword Master was definitely above Enlightened Sword Qin. But now, the Blood Shadow Sword Master had died in the passageway. Instead, it was Sword Immortal Qin who had passed the test. This left everyone scratching their heads. However, they could tell that the test was not based on strength alone. It did not mean that the stronger one was, the easier it was to pass the test. After hearing the news, a few sword cultivators heaved a sigh of relief. Their strength was close to Enlightened Sword Qin's, but they were weaker than Blood Shadow Sword Master. Their faces had all turned ashen when they saw the Blood Shadow Sword Master die in the passageway. However, there was no way out now, so they could only brace themselves and wait. Now that they saw Enlightened Sword Qin pass the test, it gave them some confidence. It proved that they had a chance to pass the test with their strength. If it's not a test of strength, then it must be a test of sword intent. The Upper Sword Sect's inheritance test is naturally not just a test of strength. Chu Fengmian thought to himself as he watched the scene. However, I can't find out what's in the tunnel and can't prepare in advance. If Chu Fengmian could find out what was in the tunnel, he could prepare in advance. However, he could not find out anything from the outside. Once a sword cultivator entered, they would not return to the palace regardless of whether they succeeded or failed. They could not even be asked. I'll just have to take it one step at a time. With my strength, this little test won't stump me. Confidence appeared in Chu Fengmian's eyes. He was confident in his strength and his understanding of the way of the sword. Chu Fengmian was determined to obtain the inheritance of the sword clan. Next, you go in. Since Enlightened Sword Qin passed the test, Jianwang waved his hand and picked the next sword cultivator. This time, he did not ask anyone to step forward. Instead, he pointed at someone. This time, Jianwang pointed at an elder with snow-white hair. He looked similar to Enlightened Sword Qin. He was the Yanhua Swordmaster. The Yanhua Swordmaster's strength was on par with Enlightened Sword Qin. Seeing that Jianwang pointed at him, the Yanhua Swordmaster did not hesitate. He walked into the tunnel on the right with confidence. The Yanhua Swordmaster and Enlightened Sword Qin were sword cultivators of the same generation. Both of them were on par with each other in terms of strength. Seeing the Yanhua Swordmaster enter, many people thought that the Yanhua Swordmaster could pass the test. However, an hour later, a shriek could be heard coming from the tunnel. This shriek was very similar to the Blood Shadow Swordmaster's shriek. However, it came from the Yanhua Swordmaster. What's going on? Is the Yanhua Swordmaster dead? Everyone's expression changed drastically when they heard the shriek. They quickly looked in the direction of the tunnel and saw a golden light fly out and land in Jianni's hand. This ray of golden light was the Upper Sword Executor's illustration. The moment they saw the Upper Sword Executor's illustration, everyone knew that the Yanhua Swordmaster had failed. He had also died in the tunnel. Another sword cultivator expert had fallen. There were a total of 12 sword cultivators who came to the Upper Sword Sect's historical site. Everyone's strength was among the immortal generals and demon gods. To be able to obtain the Upper Sword Executor's illustration, everyone's strength was undeniable. However, it was not just the Blood Shadow Swordmaster. Even the Yanhua Swordmaster had fallen. If it was just the Blood Shadow Swordmaster, it could be considered a coincidence. However, the Yanhua Swordmaster's death made everyone aware of the dangers of the test. 3 immortal generals entered, but only one passed the test. Doesn't that mean that only 3 out of the 9 of them would survive? At the thought of this, many people felt a chill run down their spine. Previously, when Sword Sage Qin passed the test, everyone had guessed the conditions to pass the test. However, the Yanhua Swordmaster's death had overturned all of their guesses. The Yanhua Swordmaster's strength and potential were similar to Sword Sage Qin. However, Sword Sage Qin passed the test, while the Yanhua Swordmaster had fallen. The tunnel seemed to be shrouded in a layer of fog, making it hard for anyone to guess. Strange, this is too strange. What's in this tunnel? Many sword cultivators were confident that Sword Sage Qin had passed the test. However, with the Yanhua Swordmaster's death, everyone's confidence was shattered. The examiner is dead. Jianwang was expressionless. He did not care about the discussions of the crowd. He was like a cold machine. It was as if the only thing that mattered to him was hosting the test. The death of others had nothing to do with him. End of chapter. Chapter 2182. Next. Jianwang said slowly as he looked up and swept his gaze across the crowd. Seeing Jianni's gaze, many of them had the thought of evading his gaze. This assessment was too terrifying in their opinion. 2 out of 3 sword cultivators had actually fallen. Those who could reach the celestial realm had gone through countless life and death battles and obtained heaven-shaking opportunities to achieve their current strength. No one wanted to die. However, there was no way out at this moment. Since they gave up on leaving, they had already given up on all of their paths of retreat. The inheritance assessment of the Supreme Sword Sect is truly terrifying. Chu Fengmian couldn't help but murmur. 3 immortal generals had entered the assessment, and 2 of them had actually fallen. This was truly terrifying. In most of the star domains, there might not be an immortal general expert falling even after tens of thousands of years. Even in the 9 domains, except for this bloody battle for the Supreme Sword execution token chart, which had caused many immortal generals to fall, the fall of an immortal general expert was already an earth-shattering event. It was likely that more than half of the people present would die in this test. That's nothing. In the Upper Sword Sect's examination, there were many who died in the first round. This time, I'm afraid the Upper Sword Sect lowered the difficulty of the examination to let you all pass. Otherwise, with just you few immortal generals, none of you could pass. Xing Xian suddenly spoke in Chu Fengmian's mind. What? Even immortal generals couldn't pass the first assessment? Is that true? Chu Fengmian was incomparably shocked after hearing Xing Xian's words. Of course it's true. Do you think that the inheritance of the Supreme Sword Sect is that easy to obtain? You should know that in that era, whoever obtained the inheritance of the Supreme Sword Sect would inherit the position of the Supreme Sword Sect's Sect Master and become the Lord of the 9 domains. The assessment at that time was much more difficult than now. Xing Xian said coldly. The current Shang Sword Sect has been destroyed for tens of thousands of years. Although a starving camel is still bigger than a horse, and the Shang Sword Sect has left behind a lot of backups, its current strength is less than 1/10,000th of its peak. This assessment is also much simpler. In my opinion, I'm afraid that the Shang Sword Sect's trump cards are about to be used up. That's why they urgently chose a successor this time. After all, the Shang Sword Sect doesn't want to wait for the day when the Tianjiu region appears and the swordsmanship will be obtained by the people of the Tianjiu region. You don't want the people from the Tianjiu region to get you and go to the Sword Sect. Do you have a grudge with the Tianjiu region? Chu Fengmian was stunned by Xing Xian's words. He had never heard of such an ancient secret. His understanding of the Sword Sect came from the records in the ancient books. However, most of the records about the Sword Sect were only a few words. As for such ancient secrets, it was naturally impossible for them to be recorded. Of course, it's related. The Shang Sword Sect can be said to have been destroyed in the hands of the Tianjiu region. For the Shang Sword Sect, some forces of the Tianjiu region can be said to be their enemies. Do you think the Shang Sword Sect will be willing to hand over their inheritance to their enemies? Xing Xian smiled coldly. Now that the Tianjiu region is about to appear, the Shang Sword Sect doesn't dare to hide anymore. After all, if they continue to hide, they won't be able to hide anymore when the Tianjiu region appears. Therefore, they can only choose a successor urgently. This time, they lowered the standard. Boy, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you. If you want to create the world's best swordsmanship, you must obtain the inheritance of the Shang Sword Sect. Not only the Peerless Sword Book, but also the countless ancient swordsmanship in the Shang Sword Sect. It will be of great benefit to your 9 regions swordsmanship. Xing Xian was very familiar with Chu Fengmian's cultivation method in swordsmanship. After all, when Chu Fengmian was just reborn, he met Xing Xian. It could be said that Xing Xian had seen Chu Fengmian's strength grow step by step. He knew Chu Fengmian's countless trump cards very well. This time, the Shang Sword Sect lowered the standard of the assessment. You have a great chance to obtain the inheritance. I know. Chu Fengmian nodded in his heart. He was well aware of the importance of the Shang Sword Sect's inheritance to the 9 regions swordsmanship. Therefore, he came this time to compete for the inheritance of the Shang Sword Sect. Chu Fengmian looked at Jian and I, waiting for him to appear. However, this time, Jian Ni's gaze did not stop on Chu Fengmian. Instead, it finally fell on Brilliant Void Skypiercer, who was beside Chu Fengmian. You go this time. Jian and I pointed at the right passage and said. Brilliant Void Skypiercer did not hesitate. He stepped into the passage and his figure disappeared into the darkness. The right passage again. What's going on? What's the use of the left passage? Chu Fengmian suddenly noticed that 4 people, starting from Blood Shadow Sword Venerate, had entered the right passage. There were a total of 2 passages, one on the left and one on the right. They were symmetrical and it seemed like they could be entered for the assessment. However, the four sword cultivators had entered the right passage. As for the left passage, it seemed as though Jian and I had forgotten about it. The left passage definitely wouldn't appear for no reason. However, I don't know who exactly can enter it. Could it be that only those chosen by Jian and I are qualified to enter? Chu Fengmian suddenly thought of Jian Ni's existence. If it was just an assessment, Jian and I might not have needed to show up. After all, once the passage opened, everyone would definitely enter it. However, when Jian and I appeared, he would guide everyone into different passageways. Furthermore, when someone passed the test, Jian Ni's expression would reveal some satisfaction. Coupled with Jian Ni's previous words, it was likely that the person who obtained the Shang Sword sex inheritance would be related to Jian and I. Hua Jianzuan's death had overturned all the previous guesses. Magnificent Flame Sword Venerate's strength and potential were extremely similar to Sword Qin's. However, Sword Qin passed while Magnificent Flame Sword Venerate died. There seemed to be a layer of fog shrouding the passage, making it impossible for anyone to guess. Strange. This is too strange. What exactly is in this passage? Many of the sword cultivators present had gained confidence after seeing Sword Qin and Lighten Cultivator pass the test. But with the death of the magnificent Flame Sword Master, their confidence was shattered. The examinee is dead. Jian and I was expressionless. He did not care about the discussions of the crowd. He was like a cold machine. It was as though the only thing that concerned him was hosting the assessment. The death of others had nothing to do with him. End of chapter. Chapter 2183. The Shang Sword sect was the #1 Sword Dao sect since the beginning of time. The most important part of the inheritance assessment was the assessment of Sword Dao. Chu Fengmian had enough confidence in Sword Dao. Time ticked by. Those who entered the passageway would need at least half an hour to determine the assessment result. Since they were outside, they couldn't see what was happening in the passageway. Chu Fengmian simply sat down in a corner of the palace and began to cultivate with his eyes closed. Previously, Chu Fengmian had absorbed a lot of chaotic qi outside the palace and condensed it into chaotic pills. Chu Fengmian took advantage of this time to devour all the chaotic pills. Chu Fengmian took out primal chaos pills from the depths of his empty ring. They fell into his primal chaos pills and were instantly refined. Countless amounts of pure primal chaos qi poured into Chu Fengmian's body. The wisps of chaotic qi entered Chu Fengmian's body and made his power increase little by little. The qi of primal chaos was a power of a higher level than immortal qi. Currently, Chu Fengmian's power was still spiritual power and had yet to be converted into immortal qi. Devouring the qi of primal chaos would greatly increase Chu Fengmian's power. The wisps of chaotic qi integrated into Chu Fengmian's power and made his power increase little by little. Chu Fengmian suddenly started to cultivate in front of everyone in the palace. This was an extremely dangerous thing to do. After all, a warrior's defense was at its weakest during cultivation. If someone suddenly launched an attack on Chu Fengmian might not be able to guard against it. However, since Chu Fengmian dared to do so, he must have made preparations. He was relying on none other than Jian and I, who was standing at the side. Jian Ni's strength was unfathomable. Although Chu Fengmian could sense that Jian and I wasn't a living person, Chu Fengmian couldn't see through Jian Ni's strength. Such strength was definitely far beyond the immortal general realm. Since Jian and I was in charge of supervising this assessment, he naturally wouldn't let anyone kill each other at this time. Chu Fengmian relied on this point. However, Chu Fengmian wouldn't leave his life in the hands of others. Rays of golden light circulated within Chu Fengmian's body as a formation slowly formed. This formation was hidden within Chu Fengmian's body. The formation was none other than the Supreme Sword formation formed by Chu Fengmian's 2,815 strands of sword qi. Now, Chu Fengmian had obtained 2,851 strands of Supreme Sword qi. Once this Supreme Sword formation was unleashed, it was enough to trap and kill ordinary immortal generals. Even for experts like the Flying Sword Emperor and the Divine Wood Sword Emperor, once they were trapped inside, they would need to expend a lot of energy to escape. With this Supreme Sword formation protecting Chu Fengmian's body, even if several immoral generals suddenly attacked Chu Fengmian, the Supreme Sword formation would be able to resist for a while, giving Chu Fengmian enough time to react. Therefore, Chu Fengmian naturally had nothing to fear. He swaggered in the palace and started cultivating. Among the people present, Chu Fengmian's strength wasn't considered top-notch. The Flying Sword Emperor and Xian Santian's strength weren't any weaker than Chu Fengmian. Especially the Divine Wood Sword Emperor's strength, it was unfathomable. Chu Fengmian felt that the most mysterious person among all the sword cultivators present was him. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor was also seen by Chu Fengmian as his biggest opponent to compete for the upper sword sex inheritance. However, Chu Fengmian didn't dare to underestimate Xian Santian, who came from the Tianjian sect. It was rumored that the Tianjian sect had inherited a part of the sword sex sword principle. Xian Santian's understanding of the upper sword sect definitely surpassed everyone present. To compete for the upper sword sex inheritance, opportunity and strength were indispensable. Xian Santian was also a formidable opponent for Chu Fengmian. Now, as long as Chu Fengmian's strength improved, his chances of competing for the upper sword sex inheritance would also improve. Therefore, at this moment, Chu Fengmian chose to race against time to cultivate. Cultivating at this moment? It's useless to cram at the last minute. Some of the sword cultivators sneered when they saw Chu Fengmian cultivating. For experts of their level, not to mention a few hours of cultivation, they wouldn't be able to improve at all. They might not be able to improve even after cultivating in seclusion for dozens or hundreds of years. It was absolutely ridiculous to cultivate at this moment. Xian Santian and Gu Qianjun also looked at Chu Fengmian. The two of them didn't ridicule him, but their eyes revealed cold killing intent. Xian Santian and Gu Qianjun had already decided to join forces to kill Chu Fengmian back in Sword City. However, they hadn't had a good opportunity to do so. Now that Chu Fengmian was cultivating, it was the best opportunity for them. This lad is cultivating at this moment. It's the best opportunity for us to take action. Gu Qianjun's eyes surged with killing intent. Shall we take action? Hearing Gu Qianjun's words, Xian Santian's eyes revealed an eager look. He also knew that this was the best opportunity to kill Chu Fengmian. However, the murderous intent in his eyes gradually dissipated when he saw Jian and I at the side. No, this isn't the time to take action. If we anger him, the losses will outweigh the gains. Although Chu Fengmian had the sword Dao Sex Inheritance sword technique, it was still inferior to the sword Sex Inheritance sword technique. If the two of them took action against Chu Fengmian, it was very likely that they would anger Jian and I. At that time, even if the two of them could escape unscathed, they would have to withdraw from the competition for the Supreme Sword Sex Inheritance. Xian Santian also didn't want to gamble. This time, the Tianjian sect had paid a great price in order to obtain the Supreme Sword Execution Token chart. The losses would outweigh the gains if they took action now. Then we can only let this lad go. Gu Qianjun glared fiercely and suppressed the killing intent in his heart. He didn't have the confidence to kill Chu Fengmian alone, so he joined forces with Xian Santian. Since Xian Santian wasn't willing to take action, he could only give up for now. This lad can't run away. After we obtain the Supreme Sword Sex Inheritance, we will kill this lad and destroy the Sword Dao sect. Xian Santian snorted coldly and stopped looking at Chu Fengmian. The Sword Dao sect's treasure. Gu Qianjun's eyes were full of greed at the thought of the Sword Dao sect's treasure. Xian Santian and Gu Qianjun weren't the only ones who wanted to take action. The Flying Sword Emperor's gaze also fell on Chu Fengmian for a long time before he chose to give up. Chapter 2184. If Jian and I wasn't there, they wouldn't have hesitated. However, Jian and I was right beside them. Although Jian and I looked indifferent, no one dared to take the risk. If they lost, they would fall into the abyss. What a pity! Chu Fengmian activated the heaven-devouring secret technique and continuously devoured the primal chaos pills, refining the primal chaos chi within them into his own power. At the same time, he also sensed a flash of murderous intent. The disappearance of the killing intent meant that Xian Tsungtian and the others didn't dare to make a move. Chu Fengmian was looking forward to Xian Tsungtian and Gu Qianjun making a move. He wasn't relying on Jian and I, but the Supreme Sword Formation. The Supreme Sword Formation was the #1 killing formation since the beginning of time. Chu Fengmian didn't just set it up to protect himself. Anyone who dared to make a move on Chu Fengmian would be attacked by the Supreme Sword Formation. Even Xian Tsungtian and Gu Qianjun would be severely injured. Even if Jian and I didn't make a move, Chu Fengmian could kill the two of them by himself. Chu Fengmian had killed more than one immortal general expert. However, it seemed like Xian Tsungtian and Gu Qianjun were extremely cautious. Hence, they didn't dare to make a move. In that case, Chu Fengmian continued to cultivate. While he was cultivating, something happened at the passageway. 2 hours after Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer entered the passageway, a sword light burst out from the passageway. Everyone present was already familiar with this scene. After Immortal Sword Qin passed the test, a similar sword light also appeared. Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer passed the test. Although his strength is average, his sword skills in the Tianjian sect have reached the greater mastery stage. He has surpassed many of the invincible experts in the Tianjian sect. It's not surprising that he passed the test. Compared to Sword Sage Qin, it wasn't surprising that Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer passed the test. After all, everyone had heard of Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer's reputation. Some of the sword cultivators present had even fought with Brilliant Void Heaven Piercer before. Naturally, they knew his strength. Next. Another sword cultivator, Sword Sovereign Jianwang, entered the passageway after being struck by Jian and I. An hour later, a scream was heard. Sword Sovereign Jianwang had fallen. Next, Xian Tsungtian. An hour after entering the passageway, a golden light burst out. This meant that Xian Tsungtian, too, had passed the test. However, Chu Fengmian noticed that Xian Tsungtian had passed the test after entering the passageway only for an hour. As for Enlightened Sword Qin and Kungsu Heaven Piercer, they both took 2 hours to pass the test. It seems that the rumors of the Heaven's Sword sect being related to the Sword sect are true. Xian TSTTTTTTTTT Xian Tsungtian. TTTT break TTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTTT 7 great sects of the 9 regions. He entered the passageway and passed the test after an hour. Next, the Flying Sword Emperor also passed the test. In the end, the one who passed the test was the Divine Wood Sword Emperor. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor entered the passageway and passed the test in merely 10 minutes. This speed still surprised Chu Fengmian. The Divine Wood Sword Emperor's strength was unfathomable. Chu Fengmian was surprised that he passed the test in 10 minutes. Apart from these people, there were also 2 sword cultivators who had died in the battle. This also proved that although this test was not purely a test of one's strength, the stronger the sword cultivator, the higher the probability of passing this test. The Flying Sword Emperor, the Divine Wood Sword Emperor and the others had all passed, which proved this point. 11 of the 12 sword cultivators had passed the test. 6 had passed and 5 had fallen. Chu Fengmian was the only one left. Chu Fengmian felt weird when he saw that he was the only one left. He was not sure if it was a coincidence or intentional. "You go and take the test." Jian and I looked at Chu Fengmian. Chu Fengmian did not hesitate and stood up. His aura burst out. He could faintly feel a kind of chaotic power in this power. In this period of time, Chu Fengmian had refined the 100 chaotic pills. The chaotic qi in the 100 chaotic pills was refined by Chu Fengmian and integrated into his power. Chu Fengmian's strength had increased by 20% compared to before he swallowed the chaotic pills. This made Chu Fengmian more confident in passing the test. Chu Fengmian stood up and walked towards the right passageway. Wrong. Go to the left passageway. Just as Chu Fengmian was about to step into the right passageway, Jian and I suddenly shouted and stopped Chu Fengmian. Left passageway. Chu Fengmian was stunned when he heard Jian Ni's words. The 11 sword cultivators before Chu Fengmian had all entered the right passageway. This made Chu Fengmian feel that the left passageway was not for the test. But he did not expect that Jian and I would ask Chu Fengmian to take the left passageway. What's going on? Chu Fengmian's heart was filled with doubts. It seemed that he was the only one who was treated differently. But at this moment, regardless of the dangers in the left passageway, Chu Fengmian could not retreat. He could only brace himself and enter. Chu Fengmian took a step into the left passageway and his figure disappeared into the darkness. Master Xing Xian has actually come out. The world is about to change. Looking at Chu Fengmian's figure that disappeared into the darkness, Jian and I seemed to have thought of something and slowly said, "Since this person can be recognized by Master Xing Xian, then let's look forward to his performance." His gaze was incomparably deep as if he was thinking about many ancient matters. After a while, Jian and I seemed to have recovered. His figure flashed and disappeared from the palace. The 2 passageways at the palace's entrance had also disappeared as if they had never appeared. The entire palace fell into a state of silence. End of chapter. Chapter 2185. Chu Fengmian stepped into the passageway and found that it wasn't as dark as it seemed from the outside. However, the moment Chu Fengmian stepped into the passageway, the entrance behind him had already disappeared. There's no way out. Either pass or die. Chu Fengmian was also clear about this point. There was no such thing as mercy in the sword sex assessment. There were only 2 paths, pass or die. Since he had already arrived at the passageway, there was no way out. I can only go forward. Chu Fengmian walked forward in the passageway. When he arrived at the passageway, Chu Fengmian felt a great suppression. This suppression was very similar to the suppression emitted by the ancient bronze door in Sword City. However, the suppression that enveloped the passageway was much stronger. Even if Chu Fengmian used his movement technique, it was extremely strenuous. Chu Fengmian didn't dare to rashly rush forward. He walked forward step by step. I wonder what dangers are in this passageway. Chu Fengmian also tried to use his spiritual consciousness to explore the passageway. However, the moment he released his spiritual consciousness, it was suppressed by an invisible force. In this passageway, Chu Fengmian's spiritual consciousness couldn't even be released 3 meters away. It could be said that it was useless. It's really strange. I just don't know why Jian and I let me enter the passageway on the left. Chu Fengmian couldn't understand whether Jian and I had taken a fancy to him or if he had other motives. However, at this point, all guesses were useless. Now, Chu Fengmian's goal was to walk out of this passageway and pass the assessment. As for the rest, Chu Fengmian should be able to understand when he saw Jian and I again. This passageway was extremely deep. Even if Chu Fengmian didn't use his movement technique, a casual step would still cover a distance of a few miles. Chu Fengmian walked forward for 1,000 miles without touching anything. However, Chu Fengmian didn't dare to underestimate this. After all, 5 Immortal Realm sword cultivators had fallen in this test. The danger was self-evident. Chu Fengmian was extremely careful with every step he took forward. Whoosh! At this moment, a sword light suddenly slashed towards Chu Fengmian from the depths of the passageway. This sword light actually cut through the surrounding space, breaking through countless spaces and suddenly slashing towards Chu Fengmian at an astonishing speed. Chu Fengmian's mind moved. The ancestral dragon supreme sword suddenly unsheathed from his hand and slashed out, colliding with the sword light in the air. Under this confrontation, the sword light suddenly changed its direction and fled. This beam of sword light seemed to have a mind of its own. After failing to kill Chu Fengmian, it actually wanted to escape. You still want to escape? A tiny sword light actually dared to sneak an attack on me, and then tried to escape? Stay here. Chu Fengmian sneered. He suddenly grabbed with his left hand and shrouded the escaping sword light. The sharpness of this sword light increased. These rays of sharpness were enough to tear apart the surrounding space. However, Chu Fengmian did not care at all. These rays of sharpness caused waves of sparks when they slashed Chu Fengmian's palm. They only left a few white marks on his palm. They were unable to scratch Chu Fengmian's palm. Chu Fengmian's current physical body was much tougher than an immortal general or even an immortal marquis of the profound heaven realm. It was comparable to an ordinary immortal tool. This sword light had already lost a lot of its power in the confrontation with the ancestral dragon supreme sword. Now, it couldn't hurt Chu Fengmian at all. Chu Fengmian suddenly reached out and caught the sword light in his palm. What exactly is this sword light? It doesn't look like an immortal tool or supreme sword chi, but it also doesn't look like it was struck by a sword cultivator. Chu Fengmian curiously looked at the sword light in his palm. Chu Fengmian moved his mind and an endless dragon's might suppressed the power of the sword light. Soon, the power contained in the sword light was completely suppressed. The sword light also revealed its original appearance. It was a golden ancient book. There were two big words written on the golden ancient book, Northern True. Northern True Swordsmanship? This sword light is actually a book of swordsmanship? The moment Chu Fengmian saw this golden ancient book, his heart was filled with shock. He didn't expect that the sword light was actually transformed from a book of swordsmanship. It was as if the swordsmanship had become a spirit and could display its own swordsmanship. Although Chu Fengmian had heard that there was a spirit in heaven and earth, everything in the world could give birth to a spirit, but this was the first time he saw a swordsmanship that had become a spirit. Northern True Swordsmanship? This is one of the 72 core swordsmanship of the Shang Sword sect. In the past, only the core disciples of the Shang Sword sect had the qualification to cultivate it. Xing Xian also appeared beside Chu Fengmian. He saw the ancient book and said, "It is said that the Northern True Swordsmanship was created by an invincible sword cultivator who had reached the immortal saint realm. If this swordsmanship is spread out, it can at least establish a sect that is not inferior to the Black and White Sword sect and the Assassin Tianjin sect. It has such a great origin." Chu Fengmian heard Xing Xian's words and looked at the Northern True Swordsmanship in his hand with surprise. This was actually a swordsmanship created by an invincible immortal saint. The immortal saint was the seventh step of the immortal realm and had stepped into the immortal realm. Even in the ancient times where experts were as common as clouds, an immortal saint was an invincible overlord. The Northern True Swordsmanship was created by an invincible sword cultivator who had reached the immortal saint realm. It was indeed not inferior to the core swordsmanship of the Black and White Sword sect and the Assassin Tianjin sect. It was enough to establish a sect. One of the 72 core swordsmanship. How many swordsmanships are there in the Shang Sword sect? Chu Fengmian suddenly looked at Xing Xian and asked curiously. Chu Fengmian had only seen a few words about the Shang Sword sect in the ancient books. He didn't know such details at all. He only knew that there were many swordsmanships in the Shang Sword sect. Since ancient times, there was no other sword sect that could be compared with the Shang Sword sect. However, Chu Fengmian had no idea how many swordsmanships there were in the Shang Sword sect. End of chapter. Chapter 2186. The number of sword techniques in the Shang Sword sect is as numerous as sand. There are a total of 72 core sword techniques, 12 supreme sword techniques, and 1 heavenly sword technique. The only heavenly sword technique is the unparalleled sword technique, one of the top 10 ancient heavenly immortal techniques. These 72 core sword techniques and 12 supreme sword techniques are the most important foundation of the Shang Sword sect. They are also the capital of the Shang Sword sect. Otherwise, it is impossible for the unparalleled sword technique to make the Shang Sword sect powerful. Xing Xian explained. 72 core sword techniques and 12 supreme sword techniques. there are actually 71 sword techniques that are on par with the Northern Real Sword technique. There are even 12 sword techniques that are superior to the Northern Real Sword technique. Chu Fengmian was shocked when he heard Xing Xian's words. Of course, Chu Fengmian also understood that the Shang sword sect was the top sword sect since ancient times. It was impossible for them to only have the unparalleled sword technique. After all, in the Shang sword sect, only the sect master of each generation was qualified to cultivate the unparalleled sword technique. As for the rest of the disciples and elders, they all cultivated different sword techniques. However, Chu Fengmian was still shocked when he heard Xing Xian's words. He thought that the Northern Real Sword technique could already be called one of the most powerful sword techniques in the Shang sword sect. He did not expect that it was only one of the 72 core sword techniques. There were even 12 supreme sword techniques above it. Although Chu Fengmian had yet to comprehend the Northern True Swordsmanship, with his current understanding of swordsmanship, Chu Fengmian could clearly feel the power of the Northern True Swordsmanship just by feeling the sword intent on it. The foundation of the Shang sword sect is really unfathomable. Chu Fengmian sighed. He could not imagine how powerful the Shang sword sect was in the past. Perhaps the invincible forces in the three great sacred regions could not be compared with the Shang sword sect in the past. This supreme sword sect sword technique is very useful to me. I'll first comprehend this Northern True Sword technique and integrate it into my ancient sword technique. Chu Fengmian looked at the Northern Real Swordsmanship in his hand and immediately flipped it open. Lines of ancient characters appeared in Chu Fengmian's eyes. Even Chu Fengmian did not recognize these ancient characters. After tens of millions of years, the characters had evolved. Unless one was a cultivator who specialized in learning these ancient characters, it would be very difficult to recognize them. However, this wasn't a problem for Chu Fengmian. Even if Chu Fengmian couldn't understand the words recorded in this sword technique, he could still comprehend it from the sword intent contained in this sword technique. Chu Fengmian's mind moved. His sword intent shrouded the Northern True Sword art. Suddenly, some ancient sword intent emerged in Chu Fengmian's mind. Scram! Get lost! Scram! In Chu Fengmian's mind, Chu Fengmian could still feel the resistance of the Northern Real Swordsmanship. This Northern Real Swordsmanship had existed in the ruins of the Shang sword sect for tens of millions of years. It had absorbed a lot of chaos chi and already had a part of instinct, giving birth to spirituality. Now, this Northern Real Swordsmanship was actually resisting Chu Fengmian, not allowing Chu Fengmian to comprehend it. A sword technique that would actively resist a cultivator's comprehension was simply unheard of in the outside world. It was also Chu Fengmian's first time seeing it. However, the resistance of this Northern Real Swordsmanship was simply not in Chu Fengmian's eyes. Destroy for me. Chu Fengmian suddenly condensed his spiritual power and bombarded it with his palm. With a bang, the consciousness of the Northern Real Swordsmanship was shattered. At the same time, all kinds of mysteries of the Northern Real Swordsmanship were suddenly reflected in Chu Fengmian's mind. On top of Chu Fengmian's head, the ancient sword technique emerged and brand new pages began to condense. After a minute, the sword intent on Chu Fengmian's body gradually retreated. The mysteries of the Northern Real Swordsmanship had been comprehended by Chu Fengmian and integrated into the ancient sword technique. The Northern Real Swordsmanship had been integrated into the ancient sword technique and condensed into a full 3 pages. Chu Fengmian's ancient sword technique now had thousands of pages. However, most of the swordsmanship could only occupy half a page. Some extremely powerful swordsmanship that was comparable to the immortal technique could only occupy 1 page. But now, this Northern Real Swordsmanship actually occupied 3 pages. Its power was self-evident. This Northern Real Swordsmanship is almost one of the most powerful swordsmanship that I have comprehended. Chu Fengmian woke up and put away the ancient sword technique. He felt that after comprehending the Northern Real Swordsmanship, Chu Fengmian's strength had actually increased slightly. Just this integration into the ancient sword technique was enough to make Chu Fengmian's strength increase by another step. If I can get more swordsmanship at the level of the Northern Real Swordsmanship, my strength can still increase by another step. This upper sword sect has a total of 72 core swordsmanship and 12 supreme swordsmanship. If I continue to search, I will definitely be able to get other swordsmanship and integrate all these swordsmanship into the ancient sword technique. Even if I don't get the final unparalleled swordsmanship, I will have the confidence to break through to the celestial realm. Chu Fengmian's eyes revealed a bit of excitement. This time, he came to the ruins of the upper sword sect for the inheritance of the upper sword sect. But more importantly, Chu Fengmian also wanted to use the power of the inheritance of the upper sword sect to break through to the celestial realm. With Chu Fengmian's current strength, it was actually not impossible to trigger the celestial tribulation, but Chu Fengmian did not dare to rashly trigger it. As a variant of heaven and earth, once he triggered the celestial tribulation, he would definitely be killed by the heavenly way. Variants of heaven and earth were not tolerated by the heavenly way. The difficulty of Chu Fengmian crossing the celestial tribulation might be 1,000 or 10,000 times more difficult than ordinary warriors. Rashly trying to break through would only lead to a dead end. Therefore, Chu Fengmian must obtain the inheritance of the upper sword sect to improve his strength and prepare for the celestial tribulation. However, the upper sword sect swordsmanship was also something that Chu Fengmian must obtain. Chu Fengmian wanted to condense the ancient sword technique of the upper sword sect. Chu Fengmian must obtain the thousands of swordsmanship of the upper sword sect. Even if the inheritance of the upper sword sect was obtained by someone else, Chu Fengmian would sooner or later kill that person and take the inheritance of the upper sword sect for himself. Could it be that the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the others died under such sword light? Chu Fengmian's eyes flickered. Although the sword light condensed from the northern true swordsmanship was powerful enough to kill ordinary immoral generals, it was still far from enough to kill the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the others. After all, the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the others were the best among the immoral generals. Such an attack might not be able to kill them. Could it be that there is an even more powerful swordsmanship in the passage that has turned into a sword spirit? End of chapter. Chapter 2187. For example, the northern real swordsmanship just now could not be said to be a pure swordsmanship. Instead, it had given birth to spiritual wisdom and could be called a sword spirit. There were thousands of swordsmanships in the upper sword sect, and there were dozens of swordsmanships that were comparable to the northern real swordsmanship. Since it was the northern real swordsmanship, it was enough to give birth to spiritual wisdom and become a sword spirit in these millions of years. The other core swordsmanships, and even the 12 supreme swordsmanships that surpassed the northern real swordsmanship, would probably also become extremely powerful sword spirits. The Blood Shadow Sword Master and the others were the best among the immoral generals, but they all died in this passage. Chu Fengmian did not dare to underestimate the danger in this passage. If it was some higher grade swordsmanship that had given birth to spiritual wisdom in these millions of years, it would probably be much more powerful than the northern real swordsmanship. Let's go! Let's go to the front and have a look. Chu Fengmian's figure flashed, and he took a step forward and walked deeper into the passage. The deeper he went into the passage, the more spacious the surroundings became. At the same time, Chu Fengmian vaguely felt many sword essences. These sword essences were all different, and they came from different swordsmanships. Just as Chu Fengmian stepped into the depths of the passage, several sword lights suddenly came from all directions and slashed towards Chu Fengmian. These sword lights, when Chu Fengmian approached, suddenly launched an attack silently, and a fierce sword chi burst out and slashed towards Chu Fengmian. These swordsmanships were all different, and when they slashed together, it was impossible to guard against them. However, Chu Fengmian had already fought with the sword spirit of the northern real swordsmanship before, so he was already prepared in advance. The ancestral dragon supreme sword flashed repeatedly in Chu Fengmian's hand. It collided with the sword chi that slashed towards him and slashed them into pieces. At the same time, a burst of spiritual power burst out from his body and turned into a protective vigor chi to protect Chu Fengmian's body. Occasionally, a few sword chi slipped through the net and slashed on the protective vigor chi, but they were all shattered. However, these sword chi also cracked the protective vigor chi that condensed on Chu Fengmian's body. In terms of power, my power is definitely not below that of the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the others. However, it is still difficult for me to block these few rays of sword chi. If it were the Blood Shadow Sword Master and the others, they would have died under these sword chi. Chu Fenmian couldn't help muttering. Chu Fenmian's Swordmaster. To Chu Fenmian's sword this time, it wasn't just one sword spirit that attacked Chu Fenmian. There were at least 7 or 8 sword spirits that suddenly attacked Chu Fenmian together. You still want to escape? Chu Fenmian's to sword Chu's master and smasters to the sword smaster to the smaster of the smaster. When the golden sword lights saw the war dragon claw slashing towards them, they immediately exploded with countless sword chi and slashed towards the war dragon claw. However, at this moment, crystals appeared on the battle dragon claw that Chu Fenmian had condensed. 129,600 immortal crystals were added to the battle dragon claw. No matter how the sword chi slashed on the battle dragon claw, it couldn't shake it at all. Suppress them all. Chu Fenmian let out a long roar as he channeled all his energy into the battle dragon claw. The battle dragon claw slammed down, sweeping everything in its path. The energy contained within the sword light, as well as the sword spirits, were all crushed into pieces. These rays of golden light all transformed into their original forms. They were all ancient books. Some of them were made of metal, while others were written on animal skin. There were 8 books in total, and all of them fell into Chu Fenmian's hands. The only similarity was that the names of these sword skills were 3 words. Rain Sword Art. The records of these 8 sword arts were different. Chu Fenmian flipped through them. Even the words in sword will weren't written by the same person, but they all had the same name. Rain Sword Art. This seems to be an extremely ancient sword art. It's said that it's one of the oldest sword arts in the world. Chu Fenmian remembered that he had heard of this rain sword art in some ancient books. That's right. The rain sword art is indeed one of the oldest sword arts. It's said that in the Desolation era, a sword cultivator created this sword art by observing the torrential rain. The rain sword art itself has no form. Its form is the torrential rain. In the later generations, there were some sword cultivators who also cultivated the rain sword art. Moreover, they had different comprehensions from the rain sword art and created different rain sword arts. The 8-part rain sword art was the strongest 8-part rain sword art of that era, and it was taken by the Shang sword sect. Xing Xian explained. Although the 8 parts rain sword art isn't part of the 72 core sword arts, it's not any weaker than some of the core sword arts. Chu Fenmian nodded when he heard Xing Xian's words. Judging from the sword spirit formed by the 8-division rain sword technique was even more powerful than the sword spirit formed by the sword spirit of the true north. The strength of the sword spirit was closely related to the sword art. Only extremely powerful sword arts that were at least at the immortal art level would have the opportunity to give birth to a sword spirit. For some ordinary sword arts, let alone millions of years, even billions of years wouldn't give birth to a sword spirit. Why were there so many powerful sword spirits in the Shang sword sect? Firstly, it was because the place contained a large amount of pure chaotic chi. Secondly, it was because the swordsmanship in the Shang sword sect was extremely powerful. The swordsmanship that could be accepted into the inner sanctum was at least at the immortal art level. After thousands of years, these swordsmanship had given birth to spiritual wisdom and turned into sword spirits. The 8 sword arts are all integrated into the Sword Dao ancient book. Chu Fenmian looked at the 8 sword arts and let out a long roar. Chu Fenmian instantly comprehended the mysteries within and integrated them into the Sword Dao ancient book. When the 8 sword arts were integrated into the Sword Dao ancient book, it turned into 4 pages. It was even more powerful than the North True Sword Art. Sure enough, it's not just the North True Sword Art. Even some other sword arts have given birth to a sword spirit. Chu Fenmian muttered to himself after integrating the 8 sword arts into the Sword Dao ancient book. Previously, when Chu Fenmian encountered the Northern True Sword technique, he was only guessing. Now, after seeing the 8-part rain sword technique, Chu Fengmian was almost certain that the sword techniques of the Upper Sword sect had given birth to spiritual wisdom and turned into sword spirits. Calm. Wonderful Book House, you're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.